You ready, Zoe? What do you think? Good morning and welcome everyone to the Environment Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyEnvironment for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Today, our main item of business is a discussion on London's environmental policies in 2023. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for lateness from Talia, Chain and Ben Cooper.
Noted. Thank you very much, Jack. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the Environment Committee meeting held on 7th of December 2022 to be a correct record? Thank you. Summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings? Thank you very much. That brings us to our main item of business, with invited guests on London's environmental policies in 2023. We are joined today in the Chamber by Mark Cridge, who is Executive Director of the National Park City Foundation, by Ruth Harris, Executive Assistant and Spokesperson for Mums for Lungs. We have Larissa Lockwood, who is Director of Clean Air from Global Action Plan, Quentin Given, Coordinator of Friends of the Earth London Network, and we will be joined by Ben Cooper, KC co-founder Dream for Trees, by Talia Chain, Chief Executive Officer of Sadeh Farm, and Leo Murray, Director of Innovation and Engagement at Possible. Now, obviously, we are a formal meeting, but I'm hoping today we can have a bit more informal conversation, so each Assembly member will take a section. I will ask guests if we can keep your answers as short as possible, so please do give the information that we're looking for, but also because we have a lot of guests to share the space. And the same question, or the same request to fellow Assembly members, including myself, to keep our questions short and concise so we can keep the conversation moving. So, I will begin with Mark, if that's okay. Mark, could I ask you, what is the greatest environmental concern for your organisation, and are there environmental indicators that are showing deterioration or worrying signs?
Sure, thank you, Chair. So I think probably the biggest environmental priority and biodiversity priority that we have is recognising that fundamentally people are disconnected from nature. And that disconnection from nature is really at the heart of the climate and biodiversity crisis, because when people don't understand that they're part of nature, it's almost impossible for them to consider how they might then go on and take action to contribute towards some of the solutions that will be useful in mitigating the worst of the climate and biodiversity crisis. So the National Park City Foundation basically was responsible, along with support from the Mayor and GLA, in making London the world's first national park city in 2019. Since then, we've developed a community of National Park City Rangers. We have 150 volunteer rangers across London. And their priority is really about helping, they're really catalysts to help contribute towards local action, towards understanding how wild and green London actually is, to help get people outdoors, spending time in nature, but also fundamentally to really be the eyes and ears on the ground to help consider what type of action might be taken at a local community level as well.
Thank you very much. Larissa, if I could turn to you next and ask you the same question. So what are the greatest priorities for your organisation, and are there worrying signs? Oh, if I can ask you to pop your microphone on too, there's just a little person with the speaker. There you go.
Lovely, thank you. So I work at Global Action Plan. We're an environmental charity working on issues at the nexus environment and health. So one of them is clean air. So for us, really, the top priority is tackling air pollution, which is improving in London, which is great, but we still have a long way to go. So we're obviously looking forward to the expansion of the ULEZ later this year, and it's very important for the health of Londoners that happens. So that's great, but I guess the question is, what's next? What else is going to happen? It's a great instrument, but what else do we need to do? We need not just cleaner vehicles on the road, but clearly need fewer vehicles on the road. We need to look at other emission sources. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into at this stage, but just at a sort of summary level to look at things like domestic burning, how we can get to World Health Organization limits on that, and crucially where we sort of target interventions as well to protect the most vulnerable, so thinking about where those who have pre-existing health conditions, where the young and the old spend their time, and how to focus effort there, and finally how to sort of bring people along with us. I think policy only lands if the public, understand the reason for it happening. So we clearly need good public information on air pollution out there as well. And I'm happy to expand on all those points.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll get the hang of it. Ruth, if I can turn to you, presumably staying on the issue of clean air, could I ask what's your greatest environmental concern, and are we seeing degradation or improvement?
Hi, thank you for the invitation to come here today. Mums for Lungs really believes that the top environmental priority for the GLA in 2023 should be addressing the toxic levels of air pollution that we have in the city and the extent to which children growing up here are breathing in poisonous fumes every day, and how this is impacting their lung health for the rest of their life. We are encouraged by the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, but we see that it's not going to be enough to make the air that children in London are breathing safe. We need to go further, and we need to go much faster to ensure that this generation of children that are growing up now, London has a very young population, have the best chance at growing up healthily and happily in the capital city. We are also concerned to see how the Mayor plans to become a net zero city as promised by 2030, and we're not yet sure of how that's going to be delivered, and also how the zero emission zones, which were mentioned in the mayoral transport strategy in 2018, how are they going to be brought forward. So we do have a number of concerns about how policies are actually going to be delivered. What's the plan, and what's the delivery going to be in order to protect the health of children, which is currently suffering. And I speak about this from a personal perspective of my own child having asthma attacks and seeing a large number of children in hospital who are impacted by the poor quality air that they are breathing, and being told by a respiratory consultant that we would be best to avoid traffic-filled roads, which is impossible in London.
Thank you very much. And Quentin, if I can turn to you as well. So for Friends of the Earth, what is your greatest environmental concerns?
Thank you. Well, I mean, we are also very concerned about air quality in London, but I won't repeat what other people have said very eloquently. But obviously the bigger threat is climate change, and we're rapidly running out of time to prevent the most awful scenarios. It's clear that from both the London Transport Strategy but also the National Committee on Climate Change recommendations, that as well as shifting to cleaner forms of transport, we also need to reduce the total quantity of car traffic and motor vehicle traffic on our roads quite significantly. We also welcome the expansion of ULEZ, but we think that the Mayor, and we welcome the fact that the possible transition to some form of smart road user charging is on the agenda, and we'd like to see the committee looking at evidence and seeing how that could be developed in the fairest and most efficient manner.
Thank you very much appreciated. Thank you all for those introductory comments. I'm going to turn to Leo Murray, who's only just settled into his seat. Sorry, Leo, I know you can take it. The question I've asked other panellists, what is your greatest concern about the environment? And the answers we've had, summarising very briefly, are biodiversity, clean air, climate. From the point of view of possible, what would you say is the greatest environmental concerns? And are things getting worse or are they getting better? And if you could pop your microphone on as well. Welcome to the committee.
Is it red is on? Interesting. Hi everyone, thanks. I'll segue on from the comments from the last speaker. I mean, we're a climate change charity, so I'm going to address climate change. You know, that's what we've got expertise in. That's what we spend our time thinking about. And in particular, what Possible does is we work where people meet the climate crisis and where they meet the transition away from fossil fuels. So. I would say are things getting better? Look, they are getting better. They're not getting better quick enough, and that is I think it's a very, very strong consensus that that is the case. And in particular, the thing that we at Possible are most exercise concerned about, I suppose, is motor traffic reduction, because what we see is that even the most vanilla attempts to intervene to reduce motor traffic, whatever that might be, it might be introducing a cycle lane, it could be a low traffic neighbourhood, it could be residents, parking controls, anything that you try to do in that space triggers backlash, and that's a very consistent story. And the scale of traffic reduction that is required to meet London's net zero 2030 targets is very, very poorly understood, and I mean that across the public. So Londoners don't really understand the profound nature of what is implied by reducing traffic by 27%, car traffic by 27% by 2030. But it's also not understood by local councillors. We do lots and lots of engagement with local politicians across London, and it's usually news to them that we've got this traffic reduction target. And as I put in my note, which we circulated just in advance of this meeting, boroughs have to do a lot of this work, and at the moment they're still working to the MTS 2018, but the implications of a net zero target for London in 2030, it effectively moves all of those targets 11 years forward, and also has the effect of, because you've got less lead time for technological transition in the road fleet, you have to cut motor traffic by more than was implied by the original mayoral transport strategy. Now, I'm still seeing policy documents being produced by councils in London that are simply referencing the 2041 targets in the mayor's transport strategy. So this is not percolated through the policy making community in London, and it is also not really a conversation that is taking place in open with Londoners. So those are the things we're most worried about. But having said that, I'll just finish on a positive note, because in fact, although I say every time anybody tries to do anything at all to address motor traffic and car dominance of streets, it's met with backlash, that's a consistent story. But actually the end of the story is also equally consistent, and that is that people prefer the new arrangements. And that is, you can trace that. The congestion charge in London, if we'd have held a referendum on the congestion charge prior to introducing it, if Ken Livingstone had done it, it would have lost, right? 6 months later, public attitudes in London had flipped because people had started to appreciate the benefits. That is true every single time. So, Waltham Forest's low traffic neighbourhoods provide evidence of that. But, I could go on and on and on across Europe, right? Every time you do anything, it's met with backlash. Once you've done it, and people are living with a new set of arrangements which have less motor traffic and less car dominance of the public realm, they prefer it, and nobody ever wants to go back. So it's a change management issue more than anything else. It's not the case that the public don't want greatly reduced traffic. When you poll people, this is true in London, it's true at the very local level within boroughs, even places like Ealing, which have found it very, very difficult to do anything. People in Ealing say there's too much traffic. They'd like the traffic to be reduced. So essentially, there's a very difficult change problem that I don't think we are adequately across. But the goal at the end is something which actually nearly everybody will welcome. It is only a very, very small minority of people who will not prefer a new scenario where the car is not king of the streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. That was really helpful, and it reminds me of the old adage about, sometimes we've got to show climate leadership and be the signpost and not the weather vane. So those are the introductory remarks. Just because I still have time in my section, I'm wary of moving into other sections, but I want to pick up Leo's kind of point there, Helle, about the public awareness and public education. How aware are the public of the environmental issues that you care about? So if I can just throw that question out generally, and please do indicate if you've got any comments on that in terms of how far are the public? Are they moving on in terms of knowledge, and is there more that can be done? Mark.
Just building on Leo's excellent comments, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough time to drag through every sort of backlash and sort of get to where everyone ultimately agrees we need to get to. And of course, you can't just sweep aside objections. So the sort of area we focus on at National Park City is really thinking about how we create sort of better conditions for those ideas to fall. Really being able to share and popularise the fantastic benefits that ultimately result when you go through that process, and you're creating those conditions. You're making sure enough people really fully understand the benefits that are possible and available in an urgent and sort of necessary fashion is a kind of really kind of important task that I think we can all contribute towards.
Thank you. If I can welcome Talia to the chamber. Welcome, Talia. We've just been going through introductions and also a brief introductory question, which is, what is the greatest environmental concern for your organisation? So if you're happy to give us a little bit about Sadeh Farm, what you do, and also to answer that question, if you just pop your microphone on as well. It's for a little person. There we go.
Thank you. I run Sadeh Farm. It's the UK's Jewish farm. It's a community farm. A community of people live there, and we have lots of schools and community groups, both Jewish and not Jewish, come down to learn about food growing, why local food is so essential to our health, to the planet's health, how community living is also really essential when working on the environment, and lots of different kind of social justice meets climate justice issues, and we frame them through a faith lens, but yeah, we work with lots of different groups. So yeah.
Brilliant. And what would you say is the greatest environmental concern?
That's a good.
It's a huge question for this time of the morning.
It's an absolutely huge question. I have actually been thinking a lot about that. There is no one. I mean, I would say there is no one greatest environmental concern. What we are talking a lot about at the moment at Sadeh is debt and debt justice. It was only a couple of months ago that we had the Jewish New Year, and we talk a lot about debt at that time of the year, and really understanding what that means for climate justice and the impact it's going to have on countries who are really struggling in the current climate crisis, and how London is really the such an economic centre and in charge of so much of that debt. And I mean, we're also talking about increasing verges and increasing biodiversity and all of that kind of thing, and motorways. But it's really at the forefront of my mind that we can do these small things, and also we need to be tackling these big things and talking about things that are definitely much more uncomfortable for people. Asking about where they bank and all that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. A really good introduction. So before I hand over, Larissa.
Sorry, I wanted to come in on the previous question on public engagement, if I may, before we move on, because we do a quarterly public survey. So it's a nationally representative survey, but there's a cut of data for London, and we've been tracking public attitudes and behaviours on air pollution every quarter since 2018. So it's a publicly accessible data set, which is worth a look. And what it shows is that over time, levels of public concern across the country, and including in London, have increased. Levels of public concern about air pollution, and it also shows that levels of engagement and understanding about air pollution are actually higher in London than many other parts of the country. It's around sort of 56%, whereas in places like Manchester, it's sort of the other side of the 50%, which is around 45%. And I can't help but wonder if that's why sort of policy measures like the ULEZ in London have been accepted, whereas when they tried to put the clean air zone in Manchester, it was rejected. You sort of need to get that critical mass of people understanding what the problem is and sort of grudgingly accepting it, if not sort of welcoming it with open arms. And in terms of the role of public engagement, also just to make the point that it works, because we run the annual Clean Air Day campaign, which, yes, it's focused on one day, it's a 6-week campaign, but it does make demonstrable shifts in levels of public conversation and behaviour change. We measure the impact of the campaign, and we've seen that those who've engaged with the campaign are much more likely to be talking to friends, neighbours, family about air pollution. We've also seen a 10% shift in active travel behaviours as a consequence of engaging with the campaign. So public engagement can work and is an important part, not just in and of itself, but also in terms of creating the context for policy change.
Well, that was brilliantly said, thank you. Ben, sorry, we've just come into the room, but we're just coming to the end of our introduction, so it's perfect timing in many ways. Would you mind giving us a brief overview of what your organisation does? And also, the first question I've been asking everyone is, what is the greatest environmental concern for your organisation? Sorry, if I could actually pop your microphone on, it's for a little person. Perfect.
Does that work now? Thank you. Hello, good morning everyone. I'm sorry to have been joining you late, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm here on behalf of Dream for Trees charity, which is quite a new organisation which we set up during lockdown. It was really a parental, primary school parental response to local air pollution, but we're inspired by Miyawaki mini forest tree planting in France, in Holland, in Belgium, and across Asia, where it's a proven success story in terms of rapid planting of trees in urban areas in a way that ensures that trees grow very quickly and effectively by planting them very close together to spur greater growth and greater all of the benefits that comes with the trees. And so in our first year we planted first 1,200 trees in Camden on a Thames water reservoir site. The difficulty was finding the sites and the land, but the benefits of this technique is that it involves very small spaces, and so it's suited for the urban communities. And so we went on to plant 10,000 trees in our first year, and we're now focusing on local schools across Camden. The objective was to focus on parts of London where there are less trees and greater air pollution, and so that's what we're trying to do. So I sent a short statement of our priorities and really what we need help with, and part of the reason I'm here is I'm hoping to meet people who can help us gain access to new spaces. That's the biggest battle. We've managed to get funding, and in fact the legal community, my chambers in particular, and lots of other firms are very keen to finance it, but it's just a question of finding the spaces. So the schools who are short of money but have some appropriate spaces. So we planted a Swiss cottage academy last month where there's a 7-lane gyratory, 7 lanes all in one direction, or just off the Finchley Road. And so we're doing a hedgerow there and other pollution-eating shrubs and trees as well. And so they obviously welcomed the financial support for that. So that's the charity. And then there's a green team at Doughty Street, which is keen to support these projects. And I'm not sure how long you want me to speak for, but that's probably enough.
That's a really good introduction. Okay. Thank you very much. And so a lot of the things you brought up there are things we're going to be expanding on. So before I pass to the next Assembly member, I just wanted to say thank you all very much for being here and for what you're going to contribute this morning. I think it's really important we're having this conversation with Londoners around your organisations coming together and discussing some of these issues. So I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Should we go around that way in terms of asking the panel to answer the questions, if you wouldn't mind? So this goes on to what the Mayor and the GLA can actually do to take action during this year and onwards. So my first question is, what opportunities are there for local government action on the environment this year, and what would make the biggest difference? And finally then, what will be needed to reach the ambition of net zero by 2030? So should we start there with, so I can't even read the lady who came in last. I can't even read the name pad. My glasses are so bad. Apologies.
Talia.
Talia, apologies.
Ask me again? That was a lot of questions.
It was. Key priorities for the GLA and the Mayor for 2023, and in layman's term, basically, is there one thing you'd like Mr. Khan to do to improve their environments?
Again, I have thought a lot about this. It's so tempting to be like, yeah, let's sow more wildflower meadows on roundabouts. And I feel like, yes, those things are all wonderful and beautiful. I'm so glad we're planting trees in Swiss Cottage. That's excellent to hear. But I just feel that we should also be pushing the bigger, like more global the more global discussions around the environment, like in London, because we're such a centre, and because we have so much finance and so much expertise and so many huge, big international firms, and yeah, I want to see the Met tackle this. Like, what are they doing in response to debt and funding international fossil fuels, which leads us into these insane situations where, you know, fossil fuels are literally new fossil fuels and fracking and extractions are being funded around the world. The climate crisis is a global thing. We cannot solve it by one little person over here planting one little thing, although I obviously do believe in individual action, and I'm glad that everyone's doing those things. I'm just like, yeah, it's the responsibility of the Mayor of London to be bringing up these big things and challenging the big international firms in London to ask them what are they doing in like their international offices for the climate crisis and debt relief and the funding of fossil fuels.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. So I was fortunate to be at COP15, the Biodiversity Summit in Montreal in December, and one of the final conclusions that came out of it, I'll just read from the sort of summing up of the agreement, which was that really now is a time of communication, education, awareness and uptake. So enhancing communication, education and awareness on biodiversity and the uptake of this framework by all actors is essential to achieve its effective implementation and behavioural change, promote sustainable lifestyles and biodiversity values. And I think it just reinforces the fact that we need to get on with this, and we need to believe in people and believe in communities that they're capable of leading this change locally. So I think from the perspective of local government in London, it's uniquely well placed to really sort of drive that local action, but we really need to sort of learn from each other and learn from the different approaches that work in different boroughs across London. I think one thing we recognise is there's far too much fragmentation, the postcode lottery aspect of whether one council will support positive action or not. It's been able to create the conditions where the best ideas can really come forward and be implemented at pace and urgently, and really led by communities as well. So I think anything that local authorities can do to create, sort of believe in their citizens and believe in and really help support them to kind of take action collectively together is going to be positive from our perspective. So over the next 12-18 months, we are substantially looking to increase our ranger programme. We've got a new round of ranger recruitment taking place that launches on the 23rd of January. So as I mentioned, we currently have 150 volunteer rangers. We would love to get that up to about 150 rangers in each borough, to get up to the sort of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 rangers across the whole of London. And then that starts to capture, I think, some of the enthusiasm you maybe saw around the sort of games makers from the sort of Olympics and so on, which I think is being bold and commensurate with the scale of the challenge as well, to really help spread that awareness of what's possible and actually support communities to take the lead.
And can I ask you, is there anything specific that you can, it's easy saying all the things you've said we all agree with, but
Absolutely.
give us a specific, this is what we should actually do.
The GLA or local councils?
GLA, local councils.
Yeah. So I think the campaign to support the National Park City was incredibly welcome in 2019. Since the pandemic, the sort of momentum sort of went off as far as support. I think there's a danger that mission accomplished by launching the National Park City. It was a major manifesto commitment, but really the launch of the National Park City was the beginning of the process, not the culmination. So direct support for your growing the ranger community and your practical support from local authorities to really work directly with the rangers, help recruit more rangers, and you take advantage of this wonderful resource that's been created would be something we're really focused on over the next 12, 18 months, and I think something that local authorities and the GLA can really get behind.
Thank you. Ben.
Yeah.
Hi.
Right. I don't know whether you've had a chance to review the summary document which I provided only late yesterday evening, but I've summarised there. So in terms of specifics and practicalities, for us it's all about identifying spaces to plant and getting approval to plant them quickly. We can then go in and do the planting with 2,000 trees over a single weekend. We have lots of volunteers, lots of enthusiasm, but it's all the people who know the best spaces and have some sort of control over them that we need access to and help with. So that's the first thing. I'm hoping. So whenever we found good spaces, there was always a different reason why there was a problem not to do it anytime soon. So we want practical help to unlock those spaces quickly. And in particular before the end of March of this year, when the tree planting season comes to an end until October again. We can do hedgerow in between, but that's the priority. And so in particular we would like people to put forward local schools, especially schools on pollution hotspots, and where there aren't many trees already. And it ought to be possible to use Google Maps and other techniques just to identify those spaces which are most in need, lacking in tree coverage. And I'd like to see a joined-up, coordinated policy which links this to the flooding. Coming here today, there's flooding all across London, and the heat islands that we felt in the summer. So that it's not just a question of preventative action, but also addressing the effects of climate change that are already affecting cities. And I would, as someone else said just now, we are supposed to be a global centre with resources, and so this is something we can help lead the way on. And in fact, we see that much denser cities in India are much more successful in finding spaces for Miyawaki mini forests than we have been in London. So it'd be good if we can be ambassadors for this and take the lead and find an organised way to achieve it over the immediate future. And so the other priorities are improving tree protection for established trees. Even on Doughty Street, where my chambers is, there's two immense London plane trees that have been taken down, which needn't have happened. We only found out about it after the permission was granted. We were motivated by air pollution issues in London. We would like to join together with charities that focus on that, and other charities that focus on green spaces and tree planting. We're working with the Orchard Project already, and Protect Earth, and so I think we're more effective with partnerships like that. And so maybe that's something that the Mayor can assist with. We would like to see widely advertised, better advertising and enforcement of idling laws with better powers, so that when you approach someone idling and they tell you to get lost, you actually have something serious you can tell them and do about it. These are some other separate issues which are not specifically related to the charity, but we would also like to see the GLA find ways to encourage more widespread composting across communities, phasing out leaf blowers, and improving sustainability education for staff working at ground maintenance across London, and enhancing rainwater. This is our list of different issues. Enhancing rainwater collection, flood mitigation and drought management, improving laws for preventing paving over front and back gardens, and then separately proactively encouraging solar and air source heat pump planning permissions for listed buildings and conservation areas, including solar panels being recognised as a positive thing even on the front of houses. And so we recently obtained a listed building planning permission for 86 panels on Doughty Street, which was a real struggle to achieve. We would like to do it across the Inns of Courts for all chambers and Ministry of Justice buildings. And so it was actually through the help of Sean Berry and also some Labour councillors that we managed to get the permission done quickly. And I think Camden planning officers are keen to make this easier. And so this is something that the Mayor can certainly help with. And then finally, greater pedestrianisation across London and more car-free zones would be welcome.
Thank you. So I can't read your name badge either. Mr. Murray, I can read.
Yes, it's Leo, yeah.
Leo.
Thanks, Tony.
I must get new glasses.
So if I've got to pick one thing, thematically, it is road space reallocation. So this speaks to everything that Ben was just saying, you know, all of their priorities. They require space, and space is heavily at a premium in London. You know, we've got some of the most expensive real estate in the entire world in this city, and it is at present very inequitously distributed. You know, the new census data has just been released, and you can see that car ownership levels in London, you know, the population of London has grown substantially since 2011. The number of people, households that have access to a car has fallen. And we know that needs to carry on, that trend, and it needs to be accelerated. But nearly all of the curbside, nearly all of the space that lines our streets is given over to cars in one way or another, either space for them to park or controls to stop them from parking in those spaces. Right now, we know we need to massively increase street tree cover in the capital. There is not space on the pavements to do that. Right, where there is space is in on-street parking, being reallocated to allow us to plant new street trees, but also sustainable urban drainage. You know, Ben mentioned the flooding across London. We know we're going to see more and more of that. We actually need to get a wriggle on. We need to hurry up and get ahead of that, because we've seen some terrible flooding in the last few years, and you know, it looks as though this is just, you know, this is accelerating. It's getting worse every year. We need to hurry up. Where are we going to find the space for sustainable urban drainage, rain gardens, and so on? That space needs to come from reallocating parking. You know, I can go on and on and on, because we know we need car clubs. You know, every car club car takes 10 or so private cars off the road. You know, we need to be designating space to that. We can see, you know, Wandsworth has recently done this blitz on the Lime bikes, because they're victim of their own success. They're incredibly popular, Lime bikes in Wandsworth. They're being left all over the pavement. You know, Camden, where our office is based, has had for a number of years now a policy of making space on the streets by reallocating on-street parking. So you will see there are docks, you know, e-scooter docks in Camden are in redesignated parking bays. E-scooter docks in the borough where I live, in Hammersmith and Fulham, are on the pavement. And of course, you know, that's the wrong signal. People get on an e-scooter on the pavement, and then they ride it on the pavement. You know, I could go on and on and on, but basically nearly all of London's environmental objectives, the things we urgently need to get on with, will be made easier by reallocating space away from private cars. You know, even down to accelerating the shift to electric vehicles, because we know we need lots more on-street charging. Some boroughs, again, Hammersmith and Fulham is a good example, have been putting them on the pavement, you know. Whereas Camden puts them on curb build-outs. Now that's the London Assembly advice, is to put them on curb build-outs, but it's only advice. There's no conditions attached to funding or anything. So I've read a TfL document saying that one of the key barriers to rolling out rapid charge point infrastructure for the high mileage vehicles like taxis and delivery vehicles that are responsible for most of the miles on London's roads, one of the key barriers is finding space. Well, the TLRN, the road network that TfL manages, has lots of free parking on it, right? I can give you a clue about where to look for that space, which this document is saying, it's so hard to find. So just thematically, it's reallocating road space just unlocks a whole load of this other stuff that we know needs to happen urgently, and realistically, there's nowhere else to look for that space. London does not have lots of empty space that is not performing some function at the moment, and the thing we know we need to have less of is cars, private cars, and then we need all this other stuff: bus priority lanes, cycle lanes, etc., etc. So, with respect to like a concrete, specific action, really 2023 needs to see a revision to the Mayor's transport strategy. It needs to either be reissued or, an addendum issued that brings up to date the detailed targets that are set out in the MTS, because, those need to be percolating through into local implementation plans that boroughs are accountable for. Because at the moment, like I say, they're still working to the old targets. And then I would also like to see, there are a couple of other things. The Mayor has powers to deliver functional transport networks that have been going unused. So you won't like this, Tony, but I think Kensington High Street is a very good example of Kensington, just simply refuses to host any protected cycle infrastructure, and what that means is that it cuts off everybody to the west of Kensington from accessing central London. So you cannot expect a big modal shift of commuting by bike from West London without a safe route through Kensington, and there isn't one at the moment. I know that the Mayor is not, doesn't control that road, but actually probably should be at this point requesting the Secretary of State to hand it over so that it becomes part of the TLRN, because Kensington's just not going to do anything about this. So that's a good example. And then there are some other things as well, which many would regard as symbolic, but actually we think are very important, because ultimately I agree with Mark's comments about the most important thing that local government in London can do is actually support people to make better choices in their own lives, right? So that's the really big impact comes when we're changing behaviours of Londoners en masse. And one thing which seems very intuitive to me is that we shouldn't be advertising petrol and diesel cars on our public transport network. We've written to Seb Dance asking him to amend the code of acceptance for advertising on the TfL advertising estate. That has happened for high fat and salt and sugar content food. So you can't advertise junk foods on the tube or buses anymore. And that is because the Mayor has a food strategy. And the Mayor's food strategy, the code of acceptance has been aligned with the food strategy. Now, the Mayor also has a transport strategy and an environment strategy, and our advertising policy on TfL's estate, which is one of the biggest and highest value in the whole world of any out-of-home advertising estate, is not aligned. We're still allowing fossil fuel companies to advertise on the tube, and we're allowing. it just makes no sense to be selling SUVs to captive audiences on the Elizabeth line. That's just so. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we be a bit shorter of answers, please? Larissa?
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
So totally support what Leo says. We need fewer vehicles on the road. So, yes, ULEZ has to happen this year, but we also need to get the number of vehicles on the roads down. And part of that will be around reallocating space, creating those cleaner air communities, which people do like when they happen, when there's reduced traffic and greater priority given to pedestrians and cyclists, and to continue the investment in walking and cycling as well. We know that about a quarter of journeys on London's roads are under 2 miles, so they could be walked or cycled within 15 to 30 minutes. So really targeting those ones. But you can't expect people to get out their cars and walk or cycle if there's not decent infrastructure in place. So that is crucial. But then the thing I'd like to think about today as well is some of these other sources of air pollution and particulate matter pollution, especially PM2.5, which many consider to be the most dangerous. And traffic is not the biggest source of this. Domestic burning is a really big source of this. So log burners in domestic settings, fire pits and so on in people's gardens. And we need to reverse the trend because more and more people are putting them in. And we know that most people who have them don't necessarily need them. It is the higher socioeconomic groups who have them more as a lifestyle choice than a heating necessity. The majority of London is on mains gas. So for many, it is a lifestyle accessory that is causing a huge health burden. I think we need to reverse that trend. We need to look towards a ban, ultimately. It needs to be a phase-out, and it will be a slow journey, because we've been doing a piece of work with the GLA and Impact on Urban Health, looking at where people are at on this journey, and the public will not accept a ban right now. Public want information so that they can make informed choices, because otherwise we risk this becoming, I think, a bit like diesel, in that people think they're doing something because it's better for the environment, because some people are putting them in for that reason, only to discover a few months, years down the line that that's really not the case, and then stop using them. It's an expensive mistake to make, and in the meantime it's costing lives. So I think it'd be really good to pay attention to PM2.5 and especially to domestic burning. As part of that, the need for a public information campaign, because as I say, people don't know that they're a source of air pollution, how bad they are for health, therefore are making ill-informed choices, which also doesn't seem right. But a broader public information campaign on air pollution to help people understand the gravity of the situation, to welcome the measures that are needed and to change their behaviours as well. And then last point around the clean air places, we do need to pay attention to where those who are most vulnerable are exposed to air pollution. So it is those with existing health conditions, it is children, it is the elderly. So we really do need to make sure that schools continue to be supported to tackle air pollution, that hospitals are supported, that care homes are supported. I haven't seen any work in care homes happening whatsoever, and also to make sure that the measures we put in place are benefiting those who most need it, because it is those often in the more deprived areas where levels of air pollution are higher. Those people are also often have that sort of more adverse health outcomes as well, but are contributing least to the problem. That's where car ownership is lowest. That's where people don't have domestic burners. So there is a sort of inequality element to this, and we need to make sure we're not just making it better where people are more vocal, but actually better where people really need improved air quality to improve their lives and health.
Thank you. Ruth?
Hi, I'd just like to echo a few of the things that Larissa has said about wood burning. This is becoming a major problem with the sales of wood burning stoves last year were double what they were the previous year. And the evidence has been emerging all the time about how harmful it is to breathe in particulate matter that comes from burning wood. And it is really staggering how few people actually realise that this is a problem. If you speak to neighbours or friends about it, they really, well, I put that in because I thought burning wood was a environmentally friendly thing to do. It's a really difficult thing to campaign on because it seems very, on the surface of it, very wholesome and cosy and warm at a time where people need a lot of comfort, and so we're finding it's a very difficult issue to campaign on. Awareness is beginning to grow, but we really need the support of the Mayor's office on this, and we're pleased we've had the support of some Assembly members so far on this issue, but we're a bit disappointed that we're kind of in the middle of winter again and we haven't seen any public awareness raising campaign from the Mayor's office take place about this. But in terms of what action would we like to see the Mayor take, I would just really like to bring back this issue of air pollution to being one about a public health crisis of grave proportions that is affecting children fundamentally. Children in London growing up have a smaller lung capacity of those growing up in rural places such as Wales, and up to 10% reduced lung capacity. Your health as you grow and develop as a young child is a really strong indicator of your health outcomes in later life. So we're really missing a window of opportunity for children in London to grow up healthily and to enjoy good health. So that's really disappointing. So we really want to see the Mayor's office taking this issue really seriously, seeing ULEZ as a good step, but what is actually next? What's going to happen next to bring down car use, to phase out diesel, and to reduce the levels of toxic air that we are all breathing in, and they don't just affect the respiratory system, they affect every organ in the whole body. So firstly, we'd like to see the issue taken really seriously. The second thing is that we'd like to see a really defined pathway towards net zero. What is actually going to happen, and how is London going to comply with the World Health Organization guidelines on air pollution limits? How is that actually going to happen? You know, when and what? I've covered wood burning. So I think that's all I have to say for now. I'm sure I'll think of some other things afterwards.
Thank you. And finally, sorry, Quinton, you're last.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, completely agree with pretty much everything that all my colleagues have already said, so I won't repeat that. Very much welcome what's been said about burning, and perhaps I could just add that a sort of local point. I live next to a waterway, and if you've got waterways, navigable waterways in your areas, you'll know that canal boats, like wood-burning stoves, canal boats have also massively increased in numbers in the last few years, and a very large number of them heat themselves, or the occupants heat themselves by burning. And they might burn wood, but they might burn anything else they can get hold of if their finances are restricted. And it's really time that the Mayor got to grips with the Canal and River Trust and introduced a proper ban on burning on canal boats, particularly where they're moored alongside residential properties. It's long overdue. I wanted to introduce another sort of section of policy, which is around our buildings. I was on a train going to Rainham Marshes on Friday, and I realised with horror that I was passing those buildings, those homes in Wennington, out near Rainham, that were destroyed in the fire last July, and the horror that we all felt of seeing our country going up in smoke. And I don't know how long people's memories are, because I know that at the time it had a huge impact on people's consciousness about climate change. But I'm not sure that we, as a movement and as local authorities, really sort of captured that sense of horror that people had. And I think we need to maybe do more of that. But one particular area that we need to do clearly more on is our buildings. Certainly in Haringey, 50% of our CO2 emissions are from our homes, from our electricity and primarily gas use. Now, we have a bit more movement coming from government about funding insulation programmes, but it's nowhere near enough. We need much tougher standards being set both for new and existing buildings. We need a lot more funding, but we also need a lot more of the people who've got the skills to retrofit our buildings. I've attended a couple of the City Skyline events organised by the City of London, looking at the skills gap in London. They're looking at it primarily from a sort of commercial buildings point of view, but the issues that are coming forward are equally apply, if not more so, to the residential sector. We have a massive shortage of building workers. I mean, by building, I mean not just people who put bricks together, but the whole of construction, design, electricians, IT, the whole sector. Massive shortage, and particularly in terms of the greener end of that. We've got lots of gas engineers, but very few people able to fit heat pumps, and so on and so forth. And although the Mayor has done work around the Green Academy, we're still far from a situation where a 16-year-old in Tottenham or Lambeth would know, as they're thinking about what will their career be, that they know that there's an environmental area of work, which is the construction industry. We've got to green up the image of construction, and we've got to make a very transparent and simple path for people thinking about what they're going to be doing in their lives into that sector. So I know there are initiatives, but I think we need to have something much more joined up, so that we don't just have building companies who've got a particular project in a borough dropping into the schools in that area to talk about green construction, but a systematic programme of relationships with schools that really makes the sector much more attractive and much more urgent for people.
I'll hand back to you, Chair. Very interested in interactions by every speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Cooper.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to come back. I'd like to start with Larissa, because some of what you're talking about, some of what all of you were talking about, and you're sort of saying the mayor should do more, and Ruth particularly was saying that. But doesn't some of this come down to the lack of legislation, which has to be done at parliamentary level? We can't have a proper campaign around wood-burning stoves in London if, meanwhile, in Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol and Cardiff, everyone is still continuing to use wood-burning stoves. So wouldn't it actually give more power to the mayor's elbow if there was legislation that went through Parliament that banned the use of wood-burning stoves or similar? I know you're saying that you feel that that's not... somebody was talking about being at the forefront rather than behind. You know, there's an interview with Barbara Castle, who introduced the ban on drinking and driving, which I don't think anyone around the table now would say was a good idea to continue with. And the interviewer actually says, how dare you, as a Secretary of State for Transport who is a woman, introduce legislation that stops men from having that final drink in the pub? This is a disgrace. You shouldn't be allowed to do this. Now, you know, and she did. She went ahead and banned drinking and driving. How many lives have been saved? Aren't we now at the point where we need the government to legislate to save lives?
Yes, we are. I would love to see that. And as an organisation, it's something that we're campaigning for. And the Environment Bill PM 2.5 target isn't strong enough. It's too little, too late. We need to be aligning with the World Health Organization. We need to bring it forward to 2030. But I was listening to a podcast on the way here with the mayor of LA, who, when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, said, well, instead of sort of crying, he picked up the phone and said, let's do this at the city level then. And he got on the phone to 400 other mayors across the country and got them to sort of take it on at the local level. It feels like that with domestic burning at the moment. It's very, very hard work at the national level. Yes, we would very much welcome and support and are pushing for that national legislation. And we do need a national approach. But in the absence of that, we can't wait. And I think it's important that we do this at the city level, at the local level. People have a right to know that this stuff causes such damage to health. You know, this isn't just a lung health issue. This is something, and especially the PM 2.5, it crosses into the blood from the lungs. It can get into every organ in the body. You know, I challenge anyone to not know someone who's got high blood pressure, dementia, diabetes, has had an issue with premature birth or something. All these conditions are linked to air pollution. So people need to know that domestic burning is that source of air pollution, and there need to be moves afoot to reverse the trend. This isn't just a nice lifestyle issue, and so I think it does have to be tackled at the moment at the city level. And there are groups of local authorities who are starting to do pockets of campaigns to talk to the public about this, but it's, I mean, again, it's a really inefficient way of using public money because everybody's developing their own messaging, everyone's developing their own assets. Like, we need a nationally coordinated approach so that everybody across the UK knows what the problem is and what they can do about it, and look to bring in a ban and phase out and support those who do currently use domestic burning as their primary heat source, because there are those in other places in the country where that is the case. But there's a lot that can be done just to reverse the trend at the moment by not making it such a big lifestyle choice. And I think we have to do that at the city level as much as we can, whilst calling for the national change and coordinated change.
Well, I'd like to think that we have as much power in our cities as American cities, but obviously they have a federal system, and the relationship between the states and the cities and the federal government is very different there. But thank you very much for your answer. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Larissa. I thought that was really interesting. I was actually at COP26 and the mayor was there too, and I remember seeing him speak about cities as a place of hope, and actually we are the people that can sometimes lead the way. I had an indication from Assemblymember McCartney.
Yeah, it's just to say that the mayor has announced that there are now 15 boroughs, I think, and doing some coordinated research, culminating a campaign, which you're asking for, I think, from next year. But hopefully that will then give us the impetus to government to ask them to change once that evidence is there. But I think you're right. You know, it is a lifestyle choice. I think many people that are putting those wood burners in would be actually horrified if they realise the environmental damage they are doing.
Absolutely, and anecdotally that's happened. I mean, I talk about this a lot in my life, and neighbours on the street are now choosing not to use it. It's been a big sort of reversal just by giving the facts. And we are doing a small piece of work at the moment. As I say, we're doing a little pilot campaign later this month, some very targeted work to encourage those to not buy and put in a new burner, and just to start the narrative and get out the information that this isn't good for your health, and think about that when choosing how to heat your home.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. This has been a really interesting conversation so far. I'm just going to ask about the environmental strategy, and I think this is something, rather than go in a line as we've been doing, this is a question, a very much open question to whoever wants to contribute, and don't feel don't feel you have to, but I would, we'd all very much value your thoughts. So it's kind of a three-part question. And the first is, has the environmental strategy been successful? And did it prioritize the right things? And what would you like to see change in the next strategy? If anyone would like to go first. Or if there's just any thoughts. See, we're all happy with it. Wouldn't want to change anything. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Just one specific point and maybe a more general point. In the environment strategy, National Park City was a major commitment there. And I think, without wanting to labour the point, it was seen as a mission accomplished. And it hasn't been carried through to really help shape some of the wider narrative around green infrastructure and so on as well. So I think it's more the case that there's ample opportunity to really make use of the campaign in a much more substantial way. Certainly, as we're, I'm not sure the timetable for the next iteration of the environment strategy, but certainly thinking to where we go next, there's real ample opportunity to use that. I just wanted to make a quick general point in relation to maybe using wood-burning stoves as an example. I would be surprised if most people who have wood-burning stoves aren't actually aware of some of the dangers of particulates and so on. It's that cognitive dissonance between knowing the facts and actually making a different decision, because fundamentally it's a combination of legislation at a national level, any sort of soft power and hard power that can be led by mayors and local government and so on. But it has to be accompanied by a cultural change as well. We're trapped in an old story about how the world works. And the only way to move to, you need to be able to tell new stories about what's possible. And that's the way you sort of shift away from that cognitive dissonance. It's sadly, it's not just about give them the facts and change will happen. I think we can all think of hundreds of examples of where that's not the case. So it needs the legislation, the news story, and the facts, and this great work that's been demonstrated by this policy-led organisations. That creates the conditions for it, but it needs that cultural change. It needs everyone to sort of feel they need to kind of move forward together.
Any other comments on the environment strategy? Leo, I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts.
I mean, in fairness, it's 2017 it dates to, and at the time it was produced, I think it was a very good strategy, and compared favourably with those of other cities of a comparable size. And it is the case that London has been leading globally. And it's fantastic that our mayor is the chair of the C42 Cities group now. It's a position of a lot of influence. And, lots of the good work that the strategy has delivered has been picked up globally by the leadership in other cities, which is great. I think I mean, I hesitate to bring it up, but we're a public engagement charity, and we've spent a long time working out what works in terms of messaging. What do people believe, and how do you get people to change their behaviours? And Silvertown Tunnel, even if the rationale for doing it from a transport and network management perspective was very, very strong, the harm that project has done to the mayor's credibility on the environment, in our view, outweighs whatever kind of functional, practical benefits that delivering that new freight tunnel might actually achieve. Because I just know at a very personal level, I've got quite a lot of people following me on Twitter. Anytime I tweet anything supportive about the mayor's environmental work, I just get dozens of replies from people saying, "What about Silvertown Tunnel?" And hypocrisy is, the public hates hypocrisy, and we are essentially, the human brain believes what it sees. It believes what people do, not what they say. And if their actions aren't aligned or perceived to not be aligned with the things that they're saying, then what they say gets discounted. What they do is the thing that people believe. And unfortunately, to whatever extent, to whatever extent it's true, it has absolutely stuck in people's minds, and that's been a signal kind of problem for me. It's obviously it's not part of the environment strategy, so this isn't quite the answer to your question, but the environment strategy would have had much more of an impact had it not been for that that one thing. Basically, I feel like the mayor's done a very, very good job on the environment and is continuing to do a very good job. That one project is just such a fly in the ointment, and it is it's got the potential to sort of poison the whole barrel. That's a terrible mix of metaphors, but you take my point. Clearly it needs revision, because in the intervening years we have adopted a net zero 2030 target for London, and that just does, as well as having all these implications for the mayor's transport strategy from 2018, it also does have, very profound implications for the goals of the environment strategy. Basically, a lot of this stuff has to be delivered much, much sooner than was originally envisaged. And I just think this basically the net zero pathway stuff, which we're very, very supportive of, and I was so heartened to see it, and particularly like talk of smart road user pricing and things, when the government is obviously fighting shy of ever having that conversation in public. This is all brilliant leadership, but it's not really being operationalised. It's not feeding through into what the GLA is doing, or what City Hall is doing, or more, or what London boroughs are doing. So, we probably need a revision of the environment strategy in light of the net zero 2030 target. Thank you.
Anyone else? No, Mark, just a quick question. You said your view, there was an opportunity to make use of the current strategy that perhaps you didn't feel was being sort of fully explored. Do you have an example of that?
That was directly in reference to National Park City, I guess, and I think the pandemic obviously got in the way of a lot of stuff. So there was some explicit plans to use the concept of National Park City to shape and messaging around the green infrastructure. I think it's recognising that to create that urgency, you need this needs to be a mass. It needs to be popularised. It needs to be a mass understanding from all the citizens of London. So I think it's as much about the communication and the storytelling around how these things make a difference and how it's possible for people to get involved. And obviously from National Park City perspective, that was the intention of the campaign originally. I think it's been pointed out by Leo, the timetable is changing quite rapidly. We need to bring all these commitments much more forward more quickly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand back.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask?
Sorry, I missed you.
I'm sorry. Could I just ask a question in response? I've just had a look at the policy, and it's full of fantastic objectives and policies. But where do we find the figures and the the implementation evidence of what's actually happening in terms of putting it into practice, and how can charities like my own feed into it to be helped by this policy? Because
we're about to move on to that conversation, Ben, in a moment, actually. So your question is very timely. Just before I hand over to Assembly Member McCartney, Quentin, without putting you on the spot, although clearly I'm putting you on the spot, I know Friends of the Earth, particularly in London, have been doing lots of work around retrofitting and pushing the mayor to fill the skills training gap. Would you be willing to talk about any of that, in particular with the environment strategy?
Yes. I mean, I think that we do need a lot more. It needs to be much more public, much better publicised, and making it into a really attractive, linking back to what I was saying earlier, a much more attractive pathway for young people. I think we need a much more coherent programme of getting into schools. A lot of businesses are keen to do this, but it's one-off. That all needs to be drawn together, I think. So across the GLA family, across businesses, across local authorities, I think there's a lot of potential for doing this, and that's something that we'd like to see joined up properly.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. I want to ask about your experience of engaging with the environment strategy and also any future engagement. So can I just say, to answer your question, this committee actually does hold the Mayor to account on his targets in that strategy, and we regularly get the Mayor and Deputy, or I should say the Deputy Mayor primarily, in to talk about those targets. So we do hold that role. But I've got two questions really, and my first is for those that did contribute or respond to the consultation on the current environment strategy, and I appreciate that some of you perhaps weren't even in existence at the time, but the last environment strategy, the consultation took place between August and November 2017, and the strategy was published in 2018. Can I just ask those that did contribute how you found that? Did you find that your views were taken on board? How did you find out about it, and how did you get involved? I'm going to start with Quentin, because I know Friends of the Earth were around at that point.
Yes, I wasn't involved in putting together our London-wide response. I think that at a local level, it could have been a more visible process. I mean, I wonder whether we could have for the next iteration, local forums in each borough, perhaps. And perhaps thinking about what would be most attractive to people to engage them. I mean, one of the new things will be the nature recovery strategy that I think the Mayor will be responsible for leading on in London, and that could be something that could be quite inspiring and attractive to people to get involved and help lead into understanding what the whole of the strategy is about.
Thank you. And I should say, for those that are not aware, that there was 370 technical stakeholders, and I think you'd probably qualify as that. But also 5,400 surveys were completed by Londoners, and because I should say City Hall does have something called Talk London, where we regularly ask a set of Londoners for their views on issues. So that's a big way we can get people in. But I don't know, Mark, do you want to say about the last strategy? Then I'll come on to other people about how we should do things in the future.
Yeah, unfortunately it was all a bit before my time, because I've only been in post for 6 months, so I wasn't around as part of the original campaign. I think clearly National Park City was heavily involved in the consultation, not least because we were referred numerous times through the report, but the actual detail of it I can't help with.
Okay, so I'm going to move straight to my next questions about future engagement once the strategy is out for further consultation. So I've said the Mayor does have a mechanism to get ordinary Londoners to fill in surveys, but obviously Quentin said we could have local forums or local debates. How else do you think we could get organisations, but also perhaps ordinary Londoners involved? And I can see Leah, you're simply chomping at the bit to get in here.
Thank you. Citizens' assemblies. I'd like to see a London-wide citizens' assembly on, feeding in to the design of a new environment strategy. It has been, the standard model of consultation that we have in place, you know, the protocols that we've been following for many years for developments, you know, and thinking in particular about traffic reduction interventions, doesn't work in the sense that it triggers hostiles who exactly all over the country quite, but the people who, you know, basically, although what you find is there's majority support typically for this stuff, you won't see that on Nextdoor. It doesn't get expressed in that way because the support is broad and shallow, whereas the opposition, even if it's typically quite a small minority, it is hard and it's spiky and it's pointy, and politicians are fearful of that, you know, right, I mean, understandably, you know, and so you get a very distorted lens on the public sentiment towards the thing that is being proposed if that's the only thing that you do. And I think that is starting to be recognised. And, you know, for instance, I was terribly pleased to see that the Mayor did some representative polling around the ULEZ expansion, as well as, you know, not simply relying on consultation responses. But actually, you know, so that's one end of the spectrum. That's a way to get a different perspective on public sentiment towards what's being proposed. But it's obviously quite high level and quite broad brush. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries, which are really deep dive. And when well crafted, you know, so that your participants are properly representative of the community that, you know, they're supposed to be a sort of microcosm of, and they're armed with the evidence that they need, but also the space to discuss and deliberate. You know, these kind of deliberative democratic processes. I can tell I've been following these very closely over the last few years, and I gave evidence at the UK Citizens' Assembly and the Scottish one. They always, invariably, produce ordinary people who get together, just like juries in you know, in the court system. Ordinary people, when they get together, they have the space to deliberate, review evidence. They produce recommendations that always invariably go beyond what politicians have been prepared to countenance, and that is absolutely consistent. And, you know, to the extent that the French Citizens' Assembly, Macron had originally promised that he would put every recommendation they made to Parliament to vote on. He didn't do that at all, because many of the things which the people who'd taken part wanted went much further in terms of radicalism than Macron was prepared to countenance. And so, you know, he wound up watering everything down. He didn't keep that promise. But my point is that actually, you know, there's often a sense that the public is not ready for change. The public is, you know, the public is the issue. But actually, a lot of that is inside politicians' heads, and I feel like you know, a Citizens' Assembly, a London-wide Citizens' Assembly, would be a great way to accompany more traditional, you know, conventional consultation approaches. And I like Quentin's suggestion as well. You know, localised, in person, you know, in real life events, ways for people to take part. And then finally, I would just say the power of, you know, Mark keeps saying it, but the power of positive visions. It can't be underestimated, because, I mean, just to give you an example, we did some polling at the end of last year, which showed that, for instance, you know, 51% of Londoners would like to see our city centre totally car-free, except for access for disabled people, car club cars and taxis. And it's more like, you know, it's between a quarter and a third who don't want that. So you can already see a majority of Londoners you know, would support something would be quite radical, you know. We also produced some specific recommendations. So we looked at Hyde Park Corner, and we polled people, Londoners, to see whether they would like to see Hyde Park Corner pedestrianised, and 49%. So it would connect up with Green Park. Essentially, it would be like a bit that sticks out from Green Park. 49% of Londoners agreed, 27% disagreed. But wait, we then asked, what if it looked like this? We had an architectural visualiser working for us, and he produced a vision which wasn't something that we'd just come up with. It come out of a series of workshops with Londoners about, you know, how could Hyde Park look better. And then when we polled people with that image, 72% suddenly wanted Hyde Park to be pedestrianised, right? And opposition fell to 10%. That is just one example, but it really shows you the power of activating, you know, positive visions of how life could be better, how the city that we live in could be better, if we take the action that we know is necessary, that has such a big impact on how people feel about what is being proposed. So we need to have some element of that included in this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to go round this way. And if you've got anything extra, that would be really helpful. Larissa.
Extra, I guess it's more of an offer, because I over the last 10 years, colleagues have been working with London community groups precisely on trying to engage them with sort of getting involved in consultations to sort of mobilise and activate community groups on air pollution, because, to be fair, most people of an evening are not going to sit down and choose to fill in a consultation response. They're going to watch telly. But if you take it to a group where they're attending anyway, and present, this is an opportunity, you can get involved, because people don't really know where to start. They don't really think it's for them quite often. But so it does take time and effort. So we do have to sort of physically turn up to these meetings with groups and with sort of unusual suspects as well, because we'll work with the likes of Citizens UK, and you can then get into sort of mosques. We're working with residents associations, people who might normally not make their voice heard, but going through those sort of intermediary organisations to mobilise others. And just, we've got this network from the last 10 years of community groups who have now been through this kind of process, know that they can get engaged and how. So we'd be willing to sort of put out whatever communications to those groups to get involved, if that's helpful.
It is, thank you. And Ruth.
Hi, I can't really speak to the, having not responded to the consultation for the environment strategy, but we do often respond to consultations for local authorities' air quality action plans. And in that process, I'm often struck by how many of our supporters, members and volunteers desperately want to get their voices heard with local politicians, with London Assembly members, and have lots of things to say, care deeply, passionately about air pollution in London, yet actually when it comes to getting those responses to a consultation, it's quite difficult, and making those responses really hit hard. Sometimes it seems that quite a lot of technical and in-depth sort of policy knowledge is needed to really kind of drive home the points that council officers and local politicians need to hear. So some of that it's maybe not so accessible to people that have a wish for massive improvements in the levels of air pollution, but it's not always easy to get that through in a consultation. So I would just say to have a think about the way that it's designed.
Thank you. Quentin, is there anything you wanted to add, or no? Then Talia, yes.
I guess I would say, like, I'm someone, like Sadeh Farm is maybe some kind of organisation that you'd want to, like, you'd want to consult with, but yeah, I suppose, like, I didn't even know. Yeah, talking about accessibility, like, we're just a small charity. The other like interesting groups who have a lot to say on these things, they are small, overworked, often minority-led groups of people who I don't see here today, though I'm very grateful to be asked. And yeah, though I don't really have expertise in how to run these consultations, I just, like, yeah, I guess, like, if I don't know about them, and if the groups I'm working with don't really know about them, I'm not really sure who you're asking. I suppose I've written to my MP a billion times about all these different things. He's rubbish, so he has nothing good to say. But I felt like that was, like, one of the only ways I could, I don't know, like, do anything. And aside from, like, joining wider movements, obviously, like, Friends of the Earth are amazing. Obviously had some time in Extinction Rebellion and all these different kinds of, yeah, like, groups really, like, yelling to get their voices heard. Yeah, and then there's just all these small grassroots organizations who I just know so well, and yeah, like, I guess, like, maybe all these Land Workers Alliance type small farms and just doing such amazing things and hoping that they're going to be consulted next time. I mean, yeah, Oxford Royal Farming Conference just happened now, like filled with these people who just we should be listening to. And I'm excited that they're there, like that we even have the opportunity to listen to them. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Mark.
Thanks, Ron. Just come back to some of the Citizens Assembly work, and the whole concept of consultation is so fundamentally broken. It's a moment in time where you go to a probably unrepresentative group of people and ask them to give their comments, which may or may not influence the ultimate action that's taken. And of course, the benefit of flipping that around to focus on participation of citizens, it changes that model entirely. And when citizen assemblies work, what's wonderful about them is they find consensus on really difficult issues, and that consensus is a prerequisite for political action. I'm sure as representatives, it's hard for politicians to make radical change if they don't believe there's a consensus for action. So by focusing on participatory democracy models which help you create that consensus, and these models can run alongside more traditional models of democracy, but that's when they really work. Another aspect is making a degree of permanence and not just moments in time. Having access to a rotating citizens panel to be able to really deliberate upon really challenging issues would be a wonderful thing for London to be able to do. Lots of really fantastic examples. I sit on the board of a new organisation called Democracy Next, who it's the team from the OECD, the Participatory Democracy team, have set this up to popularise the idea of citizens' assemblies and more participatory methods. And that anything that can help drive that consensus is going to help overcome, is the only way you're going to come up with solutions that are commensurate to the scale of the challenge. Just one quick point. In the UK Citizens Assembly for Climate, it was a parliamentary-led assembly. I think 5 or 6 parliamentary committees ran that. But the recommendations were excellent. But because it wasn't, there was no mandate for those recommendations to be taken forward. It was basically a nice exercise for a few people to be involved in. It didn't actually lead to the change. And so I think the demand is there. The radical scale of action is there, but you need to create, you need to facilitate those methods which are going to get you to that radical action. And this is something that can be done at national level, a city level, a regional level, a local level. These things can nest together, and it's changing that dynamic. So you move from expecting people to trust politicians and move towards politicians trusting the people. And that's the only way we're going to get to the scale of action that's required.
Thank you. Ben.
So there's a lot of local community environmental groups who I think would be very keen to participate if they were engaged, and so I think to reach out to school environmental groups. There's a Power Up North London community energy group in Camden focusing on solar, and there's industry trade groups focusing on climate, so the Bar Council and the Law Society has specific. I'm sure all of these groups would love to contribute if they were involved and informed about it.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've got some really good ideas there.
Yeah, absolutely. Assemblymember Clark.
Sorry, this might not even be an interest to declare, but I like to over-declare it. But I do own shares in Power Up North London building at Hampstead School, where my children attended. Thank you.
Thanks as always for your transparency. I'm going to call a quick break of 10 minutes. I've just got 2 quick reflections, and then Assemblymember Bukhari is going to take over and I think explore the themes of democracy we've just been talking about. Speaking not as chair of the committee, but an individual London Assembly member. So I met Talia recently at an event, and I think what Talia said is so powerful about there are so many organisations around London doing brilliant work. And they're not all happening to meet an assembly member at an event who chairs a committee who can offer an invite. So I think there is a question about how do we reach so many of those smaller organisations we've been talking about. And the second thing is my very first mayor's question ever, I asked the mayor about a citizens' assembly, and he said I wanted to be careful that I wanted to watch that I didn't make myself redundant. as a politician. I'm saying that not as chair, but as an individual assembly member. I think it's massively important that we hear London's voices, and I believe that is important to the mayor too. So I think there's a question which Assembly Member Bokhar is going to explore about how do we do more of that. So to call a 10-minute break, it is 11:30, so if we're all back here at 11:40. Thank you. And welcome back to the second part of this Environment Committee meeting, and I'm going to hand straight over to Assembly Member Bokhari.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'm going to be moving on to how the committee and the GLA can ensure that campaigners and ordinary Londoners can understand and access environmental decision making in London. But I think we have talked a little bit already about campaigners, so I'm going to focus on ordinary Londoners, and I hope you can understand what I mean by ordinary Londoners. And I think that essentially means people who may not be well aware of GLA or what the Mayor of London does, or even some of the charities that you represent and environmentalists, ordinary Londoners and how they feel about the environment. And I was really interested in what Leo was saying earlier about the loud minority that you can often hear. And as a local councillor, I hear from those loud minorities in my email inbox quite regularly. So we completely understand and relate to what you were saying. So how do we make sure that ordinary Londoners have access to the information? How do we improve that access to the information? How do we make them understand the environmental policies that the GLA and the Mayor of London is trying to push? And I really want to hear from everyone around the table. So, Talia, do you want to kick things off? Because you were talking about your group, and I think actually you represent what I was just talking about in terms of ordinary Londoners, people who are just there to engage with you and grow plants and get involved with their local community. What do they really understand about the initiatives and the pushes that we're trying to do here? Do you want to put your mic on?
It feels like a kind of interesting thing to talk for a lot of people, but I guess it's not all that many people with us being such a small organisation. I think we don't really know all that much, I would just say. It's not for like lack of trying. Like I would, groups like mine, we do go to things. We are part of, for example, Land Workers Alliance and that kind of thing. We do want to engage politically. One of the ways that I found works for me is that we have a really good working relationship with our local councillor, who's a really incredible woman and like super up for doing kind of crazy things and planting loads of trees and bringing the local community, most of whom have never heard of a Jew, down to our like local community days, which is so great because we're building community and doing something great for the planet, and then we can like bring up these kind of massive issues, but in a way that is so digestible for people. We're using literally the language and words that we use are like suited to our local community, rather than asking questions in ways that like nobody would ever understand unless you've done like a politics degree. I guess access to this is just really hard. And I think even I like coming in here, I was like, wow, this is so like, I think people don't maybe have the confidence or feel like they have enough knowledge. You feel like you need so much knowledge to come and talk about these things, but actually, of course, they do have the knowledge. They live in London, or like they live in the world. They see climate change happening all around them. They're terrified. I think like this is especially true. Maybe they don't have a vote, so it's different. But like with children who know so much about what's happening around them, but they haven't been scared off by like difficult words and questions. They'll just ask you, and we interact with that all the time. And it's such a cool way of hearing like, oh, this is actually what most adults care about. They're just too afraid to come and talk to someone about it, or they don't know who it is that they should be talking to. They don't know how to access like the people in power. I don't know if that was
I think you're right. I mean, I was just wondering, you were talking about the talking, the discussion. Do you think the language that perhaps like the GLA might use, it isn't accessible to people who just want to have just the easy learning kind of from what we need to do and what changes we need to make? Is that part of it? Do we need to just communicate a little bit more easily and a bit more in an accessible way for the people that you work with in your community?
Yeah, and I guess it's about talking to like those community leaders. Like people in my community like will all talk together. Other communities like mine, they might have a representative who could maybe talk to the GLA, even though I do think like it would be really terrifying and imposing for most of them. Yeah, I'm not sure like exactly how to make that more accessible, but it definitely needs, if it could be more like that, then it should be. And also like where's way more working class representatives and that kind of thing, you know, they're looking to people in their own community. Where are those people? And again, in minorities, like people have a distrust of these like big, like something called the London Assembly. To be honest, I would have distrust. But I guess like in smaller communities, there are community leaders who one could talk to, and then I guess, yeah, bridging the gap. And I see I do see a link that could be useful, which is like community growing spaces. They're often in like, I was just thinking about Granville Community Gardens. You know, they're led by some amazing human beings, and those people have access to that whole community, which is, yeah, it's like those kinds of things. If you could get to them, then there would be more of an ability to like talk to everyone.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. I mean, you obviously are representing a Jewish community, but then it goes wider than that, obviously. And I was just hearing from Larissa earlier, you mentioned that you are also trying to connect up with mosques. So is there an argument to say that we could be doing more with the faith communities in London? And how do we communicate better with them?
I'm not well placed to talk about the route to them, but I think absolutely they need to be engaged with and are good places to take this conversation. Because I think when we do approach them, and often it's through intermediaries like Citizens UK, and then it is just a case of being on the phone, turning up at the door. But they don't see environment as being their issue. So I think it's how do we make the environment relevant for as many groups as possible? Because people often think, oh, that, you know, that's for Friends of the Earth or, you know, the cyclists or whatever. It's not for us. We do this. So it's making it relevant. So I think it's therefore around the sort of language you use, and that's why actually we as an environmental charity talk about air pollution as a health issue. Even though pretty much everything you can do to improve air quality will also improve climate change, cut carbon emissions and so on, so which are our charitable objectives, because health resonates much more powerfully with people. So if you can talk about sort of the impacts of some of these environmental issues and talk more about, well, this is actually a health issue, you know, this is relevant to your life. The reason why, you know, you might be taking your child to hospital so frequently with respiratory problems could be because of the air quality. So maybe this is something you could think about. And again, we were just talking in the break about finding sort of environment can also be quite a divisive issue. So finding the common ground, what is it that everybody is relevant to everybody? And there's been quite a bit of research recently around this, and community is the big thing that everyone can agree on. Everybody wants a better, nicer, safer, cleaner community. And more local opportunities. So if you can sort of couch this as being a community issue, a health issue, rather than just an environment issue, I think people will engage with it more powerfully as well, and making it as relevant, locally relevant as possible, you know, because people have now had experiences of climate impact, you know, and if you can say the flooding on your street, and there has been flooding across London over the last couple of summers, and I'm seeing it in my own borough. Suddenly the penny drops, and the playground conversation, people are now coming up to me saying, what can I do? Like, I'm seeing it, I get it, this is actually now real. So making it as sort of locally relevant as possible, making it a community issue, making it a health issue, not just presenting it as an environmental issue, I think would be a really good way in to that conversation. And I would suggest, yeah, going through the intermediaries. And I think faith communities, once you start talking to them, there's so much commonality. These are all sort of common themes across the faiths, and are often very open to the conversation.
And on that kind of that kind of playground conversation, I'm very, very aware of the playground conversation and how that resonates with everyday politics. And Leah, you were talking about the Citizens' Assembly. How do we make sure that the Citizens' Assembly that you are that you think is a great idea doesn't already involve already very engaged people, but actually people who would be more likely to be involved with the playground conversations. You know, ordinary people, ordinary Londoners who aren't really that aware of the environmental issues in the level that you probably are.
So there are a couple of things there. For a start, you know, one of the issues is having an elective process just means that you get people, in particular, people who have the time and capacity to engage. And so standard consultations skew heavily towards retirees because they've got to have time on their hands. And so, you know, and so that is who you will get responding. It is also the case that, you know, having it elective means that you will only get elicit responses from people for whom this has higher salience. The issue that's being discussed has higher salience, and that isn't necessarily ordinary people. On the one hand, it would be people like our organisations, you know, the people that are represented here who have professional interest in it, and on the other hand, it will be people who are sufficiently triggered by psychological motivations like loss aversion, who feel personally threatened by what's being proposed, you know, a cycle lane or whatever. So you'll get responses from them. So you get very polarised responses. What you won't hear from is most people. You won't hear from the people in the middle if you just have an elective process. So the way well-crafted citizen assemblies work is through sortition. So you put a very wide, you cast the net very, very wide, and then you home in on people. You basically recruit people who are then going to represent a particular demographic, essentially, that is represented in the wider community, so that what you wind up with is 100 people that are the demographic makeup of those 100 people is the same as the population that you're seeking to kind of use them as a proxy to represent views for. I would also say, you know, outside of specific citizens' assembly processes, just, again, getting people to take part, you know, it's not just retirees, it's also people with high social capital and you know, capacity to participate, as well as the motivation. And, you know, demographically, the environmental movement in general we're well represented when it comes to gender. And LGBTQ plus is basically fine, but ethnicity and class are the dimensions of demographic identities where we continue to be underrepresented. And one of the things that we've started to do at Possible is to pay people for their time to take part in processes. So you're not relying on volunteerism. You're not just relying on people having the you know, people who work in 3 jobs are not going to be showing up to your workshop to spend two hours, you know, unless you're able to remunerate them. And, you know, that's not something I've seen widely used yet in official public engagement processes. But if, you know, getting people to deliberate, if you want to get that kind of representation from people on low incomes, fundamentally, you know, who have to make ends meet and don't necessarily have the time and the space in their lives to take part, finding a way to remunerate them for their participation is probably a really good thing. And then I would just echo, you know, what Larissa said. I mean, there's good practice here. We know how to do it, which is to go to the places where people already are. You know, if you put an event on, a consultation event, the people that will come to that event are the people who are already interested. If you go to another event, a community event that's already taken place, and you just have a presence there, and that gives people who've come to that, you know, they're not necessarily, don't identify as environmentalists, you know, it's not a high salience issue for them, but they're at that event, you're there too, you can get their views very easily that way. So, you know, we need much more of that in the wider engagement process.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, sure. Do you want to put your mic on? Sorry.
I just wanted to say something to what Larissa said, and then Leah also said it, kind of just that there are people working within the faiths. I would say, like, if you ask the Jewish community what their number one priority is, they would not say the environment. You're completely right. But there are people like me working every day to say, like, one of my jobs is to, like, for example, tonight there's a board of deputies meeting. That's a big like elected group of Jewish people, and I am the voice being like, environment is our number one priority. And so coming to speaking to someone like me who is pushing environment in the Jewish faith is really handy, though I also appreciate that we need, like, we can call it like air pollution and this, that and the other. I would say in the Muslim community there's a ton of people who are like Muslim eco activists who are really sick, and like, yeah, just like going to speak to them, you will hear it. And 100% the paying people thing within our own organization, especially now we're talking about like where racism and environmental justice link up, and that's what I'm talking about when we talk about global things. If you talk to these people without understanding the intersection of these things, they're just not going to listen, because they're going to be like, you don't really care. But if there's an understanding of these intersection of these things, and therefore once you know that, obviously you are paying people for their time, yeah, you will see like ethnicity and class, like that change happen. Yeah, sorry.
I completely agree with what you said. I know some of those Muslim environmental activists as well, and the Muslim Council of Britain have been doing a massive initiative on focusing on green policies, and so many other faith groups. So I'm so pleased that you're pushing that within your own community, and I think there are other groups as well that we really do need to start connecting up with. Ben, we were talking about playground conversations. I'm sure that was something that was part of the growth of your work. But tell us a little bit about the information and access to information from the GLA. Do you think that the community that you work with are able to access that information? Do they understand the environmental decision making that's happening here in London? You're shaking your head.
No, sorry, you have to search it out, and I don't think it's as accessible as it could or should be. I think the local paper where I live, the Camden New Journal, is quite good at pushing information on this, and I think the local papers have a big role to play in terms of disseminating this information. I wonder whether this group can feed in with the journalists there to help get certain messages out. There's certainly a fertile ground. And I wonder also with schools, to what extent certain schools have teacher-led environmental climate groups, and I'm sure lots don't. I wonder whether there's a way of ensuring that it's more part of the curriculum and more part of the basics of school life to get people involved that way, in terms of reaching out to wider demographics and different communities. The Camden Climate Alliance is quite I think a good vehicle for education in this sphere. I wonder whether Camden's more advanced than many other boroughs with this sort of initiative, and I know from living in Lambeth before that there's many fewer initiatives in this field and many fewer trees and so on. And so I think the local authorities are better organised and more advanced, could usefully share their strategies, their policies with others to get everyone on the same page. And I was thinking also the business aspect to the Camden Climate Alliance. So our business in Camden signed up, and there are financial incentives in terms of what Leo was talking about. If that's a way of getting more engagement, then that's another way to do it. So I wonder how many equivalent climate alliances there are among business communities, even small business, who can benefit financially from the incentives on offer in terms of net zero transition. It'd be good to make that a widespread project across London. I think in terms of what other people were saying, we as explained, we grew out of lockdown and the social isolation from that, and we had a huge groundswell of community support. Everyone wanted to get involved, and so there's a huge aesthetic element and well-being benefit and social togetherness about these projects. So I think it's worth emphasising that and harnessing that where possible.
Thank you. I mean, there's definitely an element of the need to make it less about policies coming from the GLA, but more of a community approach to all of these in this environmental strategy. You're nodding your head. Please come in with your comment about how we need to do better when it comes to accessing information.
I think there've been some excellent points made already. I mean, I think it's just reinforcing that messages are heard when it comes from someone you know, from someone within your community, from a friend, a family member. And so the more that... I think a lot of what's been discussed today is normalising these different ways of doing things and normalising it through these sort of the hugely diverse communities that exist in London. And so anything that can... being supportive and celebrating the great work that's done, celebrating the wonderful examples, connecting up your really active groups is a really sort of practical way of making that change happen. We see it through our ranger community. The strategy we use there is very intentionally finding people who are just doing amazing stuff within communities already, or are really keen to get involved but maybe don't know where to start, and sort of pairing those types of people up is a great way of kind of continuing that enthusiasm but really supporting that sort of community-led action as much as possible. So I mean, I think it's been demonstrated the ideas exist. We know what we need to do. It's creating the conditions within communities so they can really kind of take that forward.
Hannah, I'm sorry, I wanted to make, just before we move off this question, I just checked with a colleague, and the ULEZ expansion, you asked, do we need to communicate in simpler terms to Londoners? And I can tell you that, we became aware that the ULEZ expansion, which we were very supportive of, out to the M75, we became aware that the link to the consultation was being circulated on sort of far-right libertarian groups, not based in London, all over the place. And we were seeing it cropping up. So there was a big push, well beyond the boundaries of London to get people to respond and say, no, don't do this. And so we were like, well, look, we ought to send the link to our own supporters in London. And my comms team had a go on the consultation, and they were like, this is absolutely awful and no one is going to complete the process. And so we made a tool that just simplified it so that one could send a much simplified response to the consultation. And over 5,000 people used that tool to respond, which I mean, I saw some weird criticisms of this in the press, as if somehow we were sort of shilling for the mayor or whatever. But actually, my view is it just flags up that there was a problem with the presentation of the consultation in the first place. Obviously it's helpful for groups like ours to put it in front of people who are likely to be supportive, but it was more we made it easy, so it only took 2 minutes to do. That led to that number of responses, I think. Thank you.
I'm really pleased you did that. Makes it a lot easier for people, and I think simplicity of language and messages is so important. I'm going to move on to Mums for Lungs, because actually you inspired the motion that I did on wood burning last year. So firstly, thank you so much, because that was actually a really simple message and it came from your community. So what do you think we could be doing in the GLA to make sure that that message is continually accessible to the groups that you represent, and making it easy to access and engage with the things that we need to do in terms of the London Assembly to push for those particular changes, like wood burning?
I think we need a public awareness campaign on wood burning, which I think is relatively straightforward to design and to organise, and doesn't require the backing of national government. But I think one of the things we're talking about here now is, how do we reach out to people? How do we engage with people? And one of the things that I've noticed that's really interesting about when volunteers get in touch with us, we get a lot of people emailing us and saying, look, I'm really worried about the air that my kid is breathing. I don't really know what to do. Shall I put up a poster? Shall I do this or that? We get people involved who might not necessarily know what step to take, and then kind of guide them and say, oh, there's you can write to your MP, here's a kind of skeleton of a letter that you can use. If you could respond to this and use it locally, here is a blurb that you could send to your the head teacher at your child's school and get some engagement on delivering a school street. So people that really wouldn't have had much to do with sort of campaigning or civic life or politics, or don't really see themselves as getting involved in that kind of stuff, then start gaining the confidence to take kind of concrete and impactful actions. And it's interesting to sort of see that journey from, you know, that first email of I'm freaked out about this to, you know, a few months down the line sharing a letter that they've written to an assembly member or even a member of the cabinet. That kind of seeing that engagement process is really interesting and really, really hopeful. And I just wanted to also add how important I think remuneration is, and the Hyde Park Corner reimagining workshop that Possible did. I took part in that, and I had to organise childcare for my son on a Saturday because I was away from home for sort of 7 hours, and there's no way I would have done it if it wasn't paid. So I think that is really, really important. Yeah.
So much. I mean, your voice in particular is so important because and having, you know, parents who are engaged is, you know, to make sure that their children are the next generation who are going to be pushing that message. Having ethnic minority groups that you were mentioning, having their voices heard is so important because they are impacted by the environment issues that we're talking about, probably greater than any other community. And I'm going to move on to Quentin now. What I would love to hear from you is you work quite actively with the GLA. Do you feel that with the GLA and the Mayor and this committee could do better when it comes to relating the work that we're doing with ordinary Londoners that you're speaking to?
Yes. I mean, I think there could be... it's quite difficult to create the kind of conversations that you know, sometimes we're asking for. So we can have a conversation here or with individual assembly members. It's sometimes harder to then bring the relevant mayoral officers into that conversation. So I mean, I know they're extremely busy. We can't make infinite demands, but I don't know, finding ways to have a forum around a particular topic. And exploring that in depth, and then being able to follow up as well, because, you know, often there are conversations and then commitments are made, and it's quite difficult to follow those through. So having a simpler mechanism to say, well, you know, you said you were going to do this, you know, what's happened? It's quite a laborious process often to go back and to try and follow that through. So yeah, if there was some mechanism to do that.
You mentioned wood burning earlier. Do you think there is a lack of understanding in terms of the ordinary Londoner about wood burning, and what could we do better?
I think there is, and I think certainly, you know, I mentioned canal boats. I think there's a very low awareness amongst canal dwellers about the issue, and I think a lot more could be done through. I mean, it's difficult because they're not, you know, they move around. They're mainly on cruising licenses, which means they only stay in one place for 2 weeks. So I think there's a lot more that the GLA could be doing through the Canal and River Trust to communicate with people and also to help provide alternatives. Because if you know, a lot of them are living on boats because their income, you know, they can't afford to buy or rent in London, and so they haven't got a huge amount of money. But what could be done simply to reduce the amount of pollution they're causing? I mean, it's you know, where I live, we've got sort of 3-story flats, canal boat 5 metres away, smoke just drifting up into people's flats. So it's quite a serious issue.
Thank you. I could go on about wood burning forever, as you know, but I'm really pleased that there is a lot of consensus about the need for community action, and I think we've got a couple more. Do you want to go for it, Chair? Do you want to have?
Sure, Ben, do you want to come in? Thanks.
So I just wanted to ask what the alternative, the basic alternative for the canal boats is.
Some use gas cylinders, which I know is still a fossil fuel, but it's in terms of air pollution, it's an awful lot cleaner. I mean, in a limited number of areas, people can actually plug in, and therefore they could then use electric forms of heating. But that's obviously pretty limited along the canal network. You know, we're a long way from having sockets for people for the thousands and thousands of boats that there now are. So in the shorter term, gas seems to be the answer.
And then presumably more solar for the boats if they're going to use electric.
Yeah, so of course in the winter when they need the heat, the amount of solar they're going to get is pretty limited. I mean, the solar panels on canal boats are largely for topping up their batteries, you know, provide lighting in the evening, rather than for higher energy demand things like heating.
Thank you. Did someone else indicate? Talia.
I'm obviously a massive fan of reducing wood burning by all the rich people who don't need it because they can heat their homes with air source heat pumps, which they should be doing. This is why I worry about getting into the weeds of conversations without community representatives talking about like reducing wood burning in canal boats. I know a lot of people who live in canal boats because they could never afford to live in housing. So I'm like, actually, maybe the conversation is, why can't people afford housing? Why is it on canal boats they have to move every 2 weeks? So their commute goes from 2 hours to 10-minute walk to like an hour and a half cycle. It's like such a huge question of like access to like basic heat, homes, I'm sure loads of these people would like love to be plugging in solar panels to be electrically heating their canal boats. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Like the conversation around that kind of thing needs to have an intersection with like class and finance, and it just cannot happen without those things. Like otherwise you end up ULEZ is obviously so amazing, and again I know a lot of people who like rely on living in diesel vans because there is no access to like stable housing or housing without mold because there's no insulation. Like actually maybe if we insulated all the houses then maybe people wouldn't have to like move to their vans because there's not mold. You know, these conversations are intersectional, and that's not to say that we shouldn't be having a really important conversation about wood burning. So we absolutely should, but we need representatives from the people who just they don't have money or time or access to anything to help them change their lifestyles.
Thank you, Talia. I'm going to follow Assemblymember Clark's very good example of transparency before and say that I live on the canal boat. I don't burn wood, so I don't think there's any conflict of interest here. But I think you make a really good point about people who don't have the same privileges or choices I do and feel they need to burn wood, and to have that conversation and to make sure representatives are there for, while still supporting Assemblymember Vatkari and Ruth's support for a wood burner ban. Just before I move to the final section with Assemblymember Best, I just want to pick up on the point of remuneration, actually, because I asked the Mayor about the idea of a London climate panel, and this idea, very briefly, is a panel of diverse and marginalised voices in London who are based in these groups doing good community work around the environment. And I said to him, he was pretty keen on the idea until I said that I felt they should be remunerated. And I'm not here to quote bad things the Mayor said to me, because he said lots of good things to me as well. But he did say to me that I shouldn't knock good citizenship, and scout leaders and boxing coaches all over the city are working for free. What I'm hearing today, though, is a strong call that people need to be remunerated. So it sounds like an obvious question, but it'd be good to hear from your point of views. What does not remunerating people, what obstacles does that create? I know, Ruth, you've already touched on that, but does anyone else have any evidence to give or anything to say about why it's so important that people are remunerated? Leah. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, and what we have is lots and lots of experience of quite limited demographic spread of participants in voluntary engagement exercises. And from the last few years on our Car-Free Cities project, we have had massively improved, particularly in terms of ethnic diversity, but also in terms of class representation. And ultimately those two things are very intersectionally connected. But lots of London's precariat are on minimum wage and are working multiple jobs. And of course, you're just not going to be able to solicit participation from them, meaningful participation, unless you can replace the lost earnings that you're asking them to give up
during that time. I mean, Ruth gave the example of caring responsibilities as well, and that is just, so we're not experts in this. We've taken learning from elsewhere in civil society. But in recognition of this a very persistent problem, which was a lack of representation of people on low incomes when we do participation events. So there is my understanding is there is quite a large body of evidence that shows that if you remunerate people, you get a more diverse spread of participation. So I think your idea sounds like an excellent idea, and hopefully the mayor will come around.
Thank you, Quentin.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on what's happening in Haringey with low traffic neighbourhoods. I mean, the opposition, ranges from climate deniers and conspiracy theorists to, other people, less bonkers people. But some of the particular groups who feel that they're impacted or that they could be impacted are people like delivery drivers, visiting social workers, carers, with responsibilities. And while a lot of work was done to carry out the consultation before the schemes were launched, they probably weren't engaged as sectors, and I think that both in terms of winning consensus but also designing schemes more intelligently, so to address people's concern upstream rather than after the thing has happened, there couldn't be efforts to engage with those sectors about any large traffic schemes, whether it's ULIS expansion or road user charging and so on, to positively seek out people, and there are going to be people who haven't got time to give up free time to engage in participation. So there needs to be some process that enables delivery drivers who losing 10 minutes here and losing 10 minutes there could be important to them in terms of their incomes.
Thank you, Quentin. Mark.
Just definitely second Quentin's point about diversifying the ways for people to contribute or participate. Having as many ways as possible is one practical way of doing that. Just on the point you made about remuneration, I think often it's driven by a concern that if you start paying people, it opens the floodgates and you need to pay people for everything they do. And I think it's demonstrably not true. It's entirely possible to design ways of participating. If you invite someone in for a time-limited period to contribute as part of a panel or be involved in some way, that's entirely appropriate. You can remunerate them and still have that civic duty, that civic participation where people volunteer their time in all sorts of sort of community activities. It doesn't mean you suddenly need to pay all of those people as well. So maybe the concerns are that you shouldn't be too concerned about that. And I think Leo's made some excellent points about the benefits of remunerating people for the time in these type of situations.
Thank you, Mark. And Talia.
I mean, I just want to be so outraged of this idea that we all should be spending our free time volunteering for when we should be living in a welfare state which is looking after its participants, and people don't have time or money who actually know the changes that we need to be making. That's my emotional response, but I don't need an emotional response because Leo has outlined that there's a huge amount of evidence which shows that we can diversify the people talking about these issues. So if we actually care about it, there is only one option. Just like with the climate crisis, we should just be following the evidence, and the mayor's response is an emotional response to be no, we should all be volunteer. No, just listen to the evidence. Thank you, Leo.
Zach, if I may, I would just make the observation that replacing the lost earnings from people on low incomes is very inexpensive relative to paying everybody else that is involved in this process, essentially. And even if you're substantially increasing the hourly rate at which these people are earning, I mean, because that is the reality. If you're trying to attract low income participants, they're not being paid very much per hour, and you can improve on that significantly at what is actually a negligible cost relative to what everybody else that's taking part in this in an official capacity is being paid. So I just wanted to, make that point.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best, thanks for your patience.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks everyone today for the discussion so far today. Before I go on to my questions, Leo, I just wanted to come back to the interesting point in the conversation you were having with Assemblymember Bakari around ULEZ consultation and the work you did to ease submission responses for people that would like to respond. And just to ask, what engagement did you have with TfL throughout that ULEZ consultation?
We didn't have any engagement with TfL, not in any, not in any formal capacity. I mean, I'm not aware of our staff having any email exchanges or any direct communication. This was just from our point of view. We became concerned that we were seeing this showing up in fora that we watch. For anti-environmentalists, essentially anti-environmental fora, with different ideological motivations, but it's showing up, in places like I say, long way outside London, and we just felt like, it would make sense for us to share with our own supporters in London, which is what we did. We emailed all our supporters in London. We're a national charity, but we're based here, and so our supporter base is concentrated in London. We thought they would want to know about it, and making the tool was in recognition of the fact that, like, our own comms team did not like the process, the ULEZ consultation, the formal portal offered to people who were feeding in. So we just made it much simpler, and we made a response that people could tailor if they wanted. But yeah, we didn't have any direct engagement, but we didn't need to. We recognised that actually ULEZ expansion in London is of critical strategic importance at a national scale. The referendum that voted down congestion charging in Manchester more than 10 years ago has left a legacy of failure to manage traffic levels in cities up and down Britain. And so actually the ULEZ expansion in London, it's not perfect by any means, but not from our point of view, because it doesn't go far enough, essentially. But it is actually a very well-designed scheme, and lots of the issues that you can have with charging motorists for driving are, in our view,
sorry, Leah, just say we're
addressed.
just talking about, just because of time, it was
Yeah,
just
sure.
a consultation point. So,
Yeah.
so when your comms team noticed that there was perhaps issues with that consultation, did you get the opportunity to flag that with TfL? Was there any response about why they chose to do that, or
No, there wasn't, and it's not. It's interestingly, in the past we've been approached to feed into consultations. In the past, there was an inquiry into why London has so little solar on its roofs, and because we've worked a lot in the past on supporting schools to put solar on and stuff and community energy. We gave quite a detailed response, having been solicited to respond. But I don't think we weren't actually solicited to respond to this, which in my view would be an oversight. Probably the team running the consultation ought to have reached out to civil society groups whose members would be likely to have an interest. In hindsight, I think that probably is what should have happened. Perhaps it did, but we weren't on that list.
Okay, thanks very much. And just to come to the questions that I had here, was to ask around the what the guests think the priorities for the committee should be in 2023. And now, to avoid repetition, I think we've mentioned a lot of those issues, and I will take it as read that those priorities you've already mentioned of things you think the committee should be covering. So is there anything else, or things that you think are often overlooked by political bodies? And Quentin, I'll start with you, because you've had to wait till last a lot of the time, haven't you? So.
Yes, I'm not sure how the sort of green jobs responsibility of the mayor's work, how that breaks down, or how it has broken down between environment and other committees. Certainly, we see that as a really important priority. Now, whether that's led from this or from another committee, it doesn't really matter, so long as that coherence is achieved, and it really, we really managed to big up that issue and make it a really positive thing for London, for young Londoners to think, yes, that's where I'm going to work. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and we're not yet getting it.
Thanks, Quentin. Ruth?
I would say to keep coming back to the issue of children's health and keep pushing for drastic reductions in air pollution. And secondly, to bear in mind that 250,000 children in London have got asthma. Every single one of those cases is exacerbated by air pollution, and it's estimated that a third of them are even caused by air pollution. So to give it a sense of urgency.
I mean, and this is the thing that we're not supposed to do, but we've talked about air pollution, right? But I think that just what I'm trying to capture here are those aspects. So, for example, I'd say, you know, if things that today we haven't really talked about construction as much. You know, we've only really briefly got onto that. So, is there anything in terms of we've talked largely about road traffic? Is there anything else that, and we've talked about wood burning? Is there anything that we've missed that, as a committee, we should be looking at?
To keep an eye on what the actual detailed strategy and action plan is going to be. How is it actually going to deliver on targets?
Thank you. And it would be remiss of me to not say incineration as well. Carry on.
Yeah, look at construction, look at incineration, look at industry, look at all those other sources that you're aware of. It's just not something that we as an organisation are working on, which is why I haven't talked about it today, but certainly address them. And anything else you've missed as a political body? I wonder if there's something around sort of London's leadership role, and I don't know if there's anything in this or not, but the Chief Medical Officer's report and other experts have sort of been putting out modelling and data on how the UK can meet PM 2.5 levels of 10 micrograms by 2030, and they say it's possible in most parts of the country other than London, or some parts of London, and that seems to be holding back national ambition somehow. So I don't know what the conversation has been, or whether this is the body to have that kind of conversation, but to sort of have that conversation like, well, why is it your modelling showing it's still so high in London? Is there something that can be done? Because if it is, you know, something like, well, it's the PM 2.5 and what we'd need to see is a total ban on domestic burning in London, then, you know, put that to Londoners. Do you want to have clean air like the rest of the country? If so, these are the kinds of things that would need to happen, rather than what's happening is the target is being pushed into the long grass to 2040, and another generation of children and people will have their health irreversibly damaged. So I'm just curious as to that. It's just something that has sort of come up in the national discourse, and I know London has a sort of powerful leadership role nationally, and as a political body, maybe that's something to explore.
Thanks. Just to pick up on that point, really, we know that I think it's something like 85% of nitrogen oxide, ambient nitrogen oxide, from outer London, PM2.5, sorry, and then about 15% of nitrogen oxide comes from outside London in ambient air pollution. We're looking at the extension of the ULEZ in the outer zones of London, which don't live their life inwardly. They live their life outwardly with transport outside of London going into additional towns. So that leadership, how do we also, how can we better work with stakeholders outside of London?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Talk to them, I guess. A lot of the local authorities around London are quite engaged on air pollution. Directors of Public Health, I think, are a good way in as well. And on the transboundary point, I know London also gets a lot coming over from Europe, but Europe have just set themselves much more stringent air pollution targets. So what's coming across from the continent should, in theory, be going down, and just whether that's been factored in.
Thanks. Leo.
Thanks. We haven't spoken about heat particularly, and just purely from an emissions inventory perspective when it comes to greenhouse gases, actually I believe buildings are the biggest source still in London, you know, more than transport in terms of carbon emissions. Is that wrong? Leonie's shaking her head.
Domestic dwellings probably about 48% of emissions, so that might be bigger than transport, but they're not quite at 50%.
Right. So, but yes. So I think it's the biggest source. People don't really understand the imminent end of gas boilers in our homes. So it's very poorly understood. But it's also, you know, burning gas is actually a massive source of NOx as well, you know, in London. And when it comes to emissions from buildings, most of it is heating. And Committee on Climate Change, they reckon that about a fifth of heating in a future net zero scenario will come from district heat networks, and those are only going to be built in places with high density of housing, as it doesn't work if you don't have that. It's not commercially viable. London, obviously, is relatively speaking, it's a very dense part of the UK, and I mean, this is mainly a problem for national government. It is mainly a problem for national government, who've been just dragging their feet on the proper heat decarbonisation strategy. But this is the other big thing, and it's the other big thing because we're always looking at this through the lens of people and how do people's lives need to change. And so traffic reduction is we put at top of the list, but then changing how people's homes are heated is definitely second in terms of like the disruption and the scale at which change needs to happen, and the general lack of public awareness about it. And there are quite a lot. There's a spectrum of approaches here. Air source heat pumps are fantastic for homes that they're suitable for. The thing about homes need to be well insulated is a bit of a red herring, because the idea that a gas boiler in a poorly insulated home is an improvement is absolutely wrong. But lots of London's housing stock is also not really suited to air source heat pumps in the sense that it's like Victorian terraces, or it is it's tower blocks, right? So we've got lots and lots of housing in London, a disproportionate amount compared to other places that are in one or other of those camps. We've got a little piece of work with Camden Council looking in the Primrose Hill area at both of those two different housing topologies for shared loop ground source heat pump systems, which is a bit of a halfway point where you don't have to have, there's no unit you have to mount on the outside of your building, so this exists in Enfield. There's a block of flats Kenza worked with housing provider in Enfield, so there's like 7 tower blocks that are heated in this way. Each apartment has its own units, but they're connected to a shared loop, which is where the heat is actually being sourced from in the environment. This is quite new here. It's not new at all on the continent. There's loads and loads of examples of it. People have been doing it for ages. I would like to see the London I'd like to see City Hall getting into that space between the individual air source heat pump and the district heat network, which really needs central government action. Thanks.
Ben.
Yes, so just following on from that, whenever I've tried to take a carbon reduction measure at work or at home, it's always incredibly difficult to achieve in practice. There's just so many obstacles, and I think I see your role as just making it easier for people to achieve in businesses and at home. And so with installing solar and air source heat pumps, again, the Camden policy is to provide financial incentives to make it easier for people to do. But then you also need to help identify companies who are competitive and useful and practical, who can help with the delivery of it. And that's not at all easy to find. So the more you can do to make it easier to achieve, the better. And it's the same with green spaces, just helping make them available through different means is what we're looking for. In terms of other things we haven't addressed, the electrification of London buses, I don't know how that's going, but I understood there was a target and there was quite rapid progress, and then there was a lack of money from COVID. I'm assuming it's all slowed down, but I wondered to what extent you can also push for more electric school buses in the communities, and how many companies there are that provide them.
Thanks. And that's something the Mayor did say he'd reflect on once he had a long-term settlement from government, which he now has. So I and I think maybe some other members have been asking him what that means for that programme which you mentioned. Larissa, did you want to?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to follow on because you talked about decarbonisation of heating, but also to add to that cooking and gas cookers, because actually there was a really interesting report came out yesterday. Children living in a home with a gas cooker have a 42% increased risk of asthma. So it's a material concern. So just for that to be factored in as part of that, wins in terms of decarbonisation, but also health as we remove gas from the home. And just in case no one else mentions it, I've been surprised. It's not something that we're working on, but no one's mentioned adaptation today. And I think London there's some real risks from flooding, extreme heat, drought, fuel security, food insecurity, and just to make sure that someone's addressing that, whether it's not around the table today.
Thank you. And Mark?
Thanks. Just a couple of additional points, I guess. I'm going to be really interested to see the conclusions from the rewilding strategy that I think comes out next month sometime and how that's taken forward. And I think there's a general principle here of making sure that we're not short of strategies generally, and making sure that, if thinking about the role of this committee, making sure there's a path to actually following on and helping with the capacity and capability of organisations to be able to actually deliver against some of these strategies. There's the forthcoming nature recovery strategy, which is yet another layer to add on. I'm sure the development of it will be really useful in bringing together a lot of thinking around biodiversity in general. But nature recovery strategies, I believe, are not they're not legislative. They're not binding agreements. They're sort of plans that would encourage actions. So anything I think recognition, if we need to move quickly, it does need to be a combination of legislation but also leading by example. So the actual leadership that London can show, it's already been mentioned with C40 cities and so on. Your mayors have an increasingly active role to play in demonstrating that leadership. So anything the committee can do to kind of make sure that the delivery aspects of that continue and help support the infrastructure of civil society to be able to help contribute to that as well.
Thanks, Mark. And Talia?
I guess just making sure minority-led and working class groups are being listened to and representative in all of these discussions, and what I spoke about in the very beginning, which is we are a financial centre. Where is the pressure on these big financial institutions to talk about debt and the very huge impact it has in the global climate crisis, which this is. It's global and has to be tackled globally, and we have that power here, so I hope to see something on that.
Thank you. And you were speaking earlier about canal boats in response to Quintin, and you articulated perfectly through that argument what's completely wrong about the ULEVs in terms of that it's going to target the poorest, the most vulnerable people that can't afford to change cars, whereas those we've also talked about, those big delivery drivers, those people that can afford cars, that are completely untouched by this. Fine, right? So the Jacobs Integrated Report has seen that it's those that are disabled, ethnic minorities, those on the lowest wages that are going to be targeted through this new policy. Those are the people that are going to lose out the most. We've seen the NHS raise red flags about carers and staff being affected by this. So as we move through this kind of transition period, how do we make sure it's fair?
I mean, I think you have the answers, like talking to the people who this affects. Those people also really care about air pollution and the health of their children. Like, they don't want their children to suffer from having reduced lung capacity, and they also need to survive. So I guess talking to them and also understanding that, like, there is money and wealth in order to support those people and make the changes. Actually, there could have been loads done for all the people who live in their vans. There just wasn't. So, I guess understanding that there's money and it needs to be allocated to those people, and talking to them and listening to them would be great.
Sure. So, for example, when we're looking at the ULEZ, you've got £250 million spent on cameras and 110 million people spent on people. I mean, that's £360 million that could be spent on people and just getting those vehicles off the road, right? So, Ben, sorry.
Oh, sorry. This was a separate point. I don't know if you finished with that.
Can I just come in on that? But what about the cost of the health cost to people who are being impacted by air pollution? That's a huge, huge cost. It costs the NHS billions of pounds every year.
Ruth, I'm keen to come to you, but I didn't want to. I saw Talia still had the microphone on, and Ben had his mic on first, so just. Yeah.
Just to say, yes, like we don't need to move money away from solving the problem with air pollution, which is a very important environmental concern. We just need to make sure that we can support the people who are really adversely affected and every day are adversely affected by the choices of this government.
Thanks. And Ruth, you wanted to say something?
Sorry to interrupt. I just feel so strongly about it that it's not a case of pitting one thing against another. We shouldn't have to choose about the air that we breathe because we have no choice about it. And families lose money over having sick children, over having sick relatives. I know that from lived experience. You cannot work if your family are sick all the time. You have to care for them, and it costs the NHS insane amounts of money dealing with people who have been made sick by air pollution. So I think the costs of the ULEZ really are nothing compared to that.
So, Ruth, the question being, and I think it's a really good one to tackle, is how do we make it fair? Because the integrated independent assessment has found that it's like I say, those that are disabled, ethnic minorities, those on the lowest wages that are most likely to pay the financial penalty. And those groups I've just mentioned, for example, big delivery companies, not to advertise some of them, but I think we know who they may be. Those who are wealthy and can afford to drive a lot of miles around London, and they can afford to drive into London and pay those big parking fees that you might have to do that. Those people aren't being touched by the ULEZ. It's those that are least well off in our society that are paying those fines. So my question is, how do we make it fair?
It is. I don't have the technical knowledge to answer that question, but I can email you later in the week with some ideas and some evidence from other policymakers in the area that have looked into this in detail. If that's okay, I'll get back to you on that.
Thanks.
Emma, I'd like to jump in because I think this is it's a real issue, and it's a very legitimate question to ask. And there's quite a lot of academic literature now on how to make it fair charging drivers for entering, for in particular areas. And essentially, what it boils down to is. First of all, making sure that you have made some allowances for people who don't have the means to do the thing that you want them to do. So that includes things like exemptions for disabled drivers and the people who they're carers. And actually, the ULEZ expansion does include some provision for that. There's quite a long grace period for people to change their vehicles, and scrappage for people who are on low incomes, and particularly sole traders and small business people, so that there is support for them to switch to a compliant vehicle, and the scheme also has that. And fundamentally, the most important thing that you need to do if you don't want your road user charging scheme to be fiscally regressive is to spend the money on public transport. And the scheme also does that. So I can tell you that these issues of equity are very high up our list. We're a public engagement charity, and we would not have been so full-throated in our support for the ULEZ expansion were we not satisfied that actually the mayor had done pretty much everything in his power to make that expansion fair. Of course, there will be losers. Decades, long periods of inaction has led people to become dependent on very polluting vehicles for their livelihoods, and those people are now facing a difficult situation. I would say, though, that I went on Auto Trader myself to look for ULEZ compliant vehicles, and I found many ULEZ compliant vehicles that could be bought just with the scrappage grant alone, without any extra money being spent. So I know I've seen the critiques from people who feel they're being unfairly penalised by it, but unfortunately they don't stack up actually when you look at the numbers. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'd have a separate discussion about whether they stack up or not, but I'd be interested, Quentin, as well, because I think we've talked before about making it a fair transition. So did you have anything to add?
Well, there are losers. I think one of the things this does demonstrate is it's an argument for moving sooner rather than later, beyond ULEZ to a road user charging, where from the outset you can then design in fairness in a much better way. You're then not, the delivery companies would be contributing, proportionate to the mileage that they're driving and the amount of congestion and pollution that they're causing and so on. So, yes, anything has some losers, but let's then use that as an argument to go beyond and to do the better thing, which lies in our grasp in the future.
Thank you very much. Just to be clear, as chair, I have to stay neutral on these discussions. I'm chomping at the bit, but thank you everyone for their contributions. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. So I just wanted to see if I've got this right, that roughly between you, the priorities that you're expressing are the big one about air quality and decarbonising mobility, transport, the big one about decarbonising domestic dwellings emissions relating both to heat sources, cooking, and also insulation issues, so domestic dwellings and mobility. A big one around adaptation, and I can't remember who it was who mentioned flooding, extreme heat and food security. A massive piece around biodiversity, rewilding, and the whole area around nature, which several of you have mentioned. And then thrown in every now and again has been comments about skills and the need to make sure that we've got people who are trained in new skills, so that we know people who know how to fit a heat pump but also know how to maintain a heat pump, or know how to fit insulation so that it doesn't mean that you end up with yet more mould and condensation on the inside of the building. I'm just choosing ones relating to buildings, but there are others. Is there anything that I've missed from that list, or does that sort of trying to put it into larger headlines probably pick up most of the points that have been made? I can now see that Ben is going to say, I have forgotten something.
Well, actually, it's something which we haven't raised, which I was going to raise just before, which may be relevant, which is the Mayor's carbon targets for construction. So developers are currently permitted to avoid compliance by paying the local authority. So Camden uses this offsetting money to hand out some grants for solar and carbon reduction measures for domestic houses and so on. I'm not sure what other local authorities are doing, whether they have that same policy, what they're spending the money on, and whether we've reached a stage where we shouldn't be permitting developers to avoid compliance with the basic obligation. And so there was a consultation on this which followed, and I'm not sure what the current, it was March 2016 as a review of carbon offsetting approaches in London. I'd like to know where we've reached this, whether we should reach consensus that they shouldn't be tolerated anymore, and they should be required to comply with the basic obligations. And it does seem strange that when solar's become so cheap that isn't automatically going on every new build. I don't understand that, and I'm not sure if idling was on your summary list, and in terms of enforcement and advertising, but it's
idling would obviously be included in the decarbonising of mobility. I was trying to use that as the sort of catch-all for all of those idling school streets, LTNs. There's a whole sort of massive different things. The piece around that you've raised about carbon offsets, and all of the boroughs are supposed to have a scheme that they've set up to make that happen. Yes, I mean, it would be lovely, wouldn't it, if we'd not scrapped the Code for Sustainable Homes, but the coalition government decided to get rid of that sometime between 2010 and 2015, and so we're now building buildings that we will probably need to retrofit at some point in the future. It would be so much easier if we hadn't gone backwards at that point. And yeah, I think the Climate Change Committee occasionally asks the government to do more in this area, but I don't think it's possible for the boroughs and the mayor to go beyond what the national situation is. But I'll be quiet now, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Best.
Thanks, Chair. And I just thought it was worth noting that the data's just been released that London, for the second year in a row, is the most congested city. So clearly what is happening in terms of moving road traffic is not working.
And I'm sure the conversation about road user charging will come back to the Assembly before long. Larissa, sorry.
Sorry, just to respond to you on whether anything was missed. I don't know if it's sort of implicit in all of them, but I think the role of public engagement and behaviour change is crucial. And there's a very good report by the Lords Committee on Environment and Climate Change recently that said that we will not meet carbon targets without behaviour change in and of itself, but also because unless you take people with you, the policy won't land successfully and have the impact desired either. So treat it how you will as long as it's in there.
Good point, well made. I had also written down leadership, but I think that goes together with public engagement, but I hadn't then put a number next to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that audit committee said we needed to get on a war footing, and they were a cross-party committee, as are we, so I'm sure we'll be moving on that in the future, but good point, well made. So that brings us to the end of the meeting, unless anyone has anything they think, I really want to say this and I'll walk away and regret it if I didn't. I'll just give a very quick moment for that. Ben.
Just very briefly, can I just say I'd be really enthusiastic and keen to work with all the other guests who arrived today, and it seems to me we're all very much trying to achieve the same thing on the same page, and so I think we can probably help each other in different ways. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you in the future and working together if we can, if you have time. Thank you.
That would be wonderful if that was a result from today, not just the Assembly members hearing from the guests, but actually the guests using it as a chance to network and collaborate. Leo.
I'll make one final point. Just Ben's comment has reminded me, offsetting is increasingly, the sheen has come off. We've had it for a long time. It basically doesn't do what it says on the tin. Doesn't work. And, as a general rule of thumb, it doesn't work. So, big reviews of gold-plated, standard bearer offsetting schemes, clean development mechanism and stuff, they just don't reduce emissions. And I do just want to highlight that the net zero 2030 pathways, there's quite a lot of residual emissions in 2030 being envisaged, being offsetted away. But if we don't really believe that offsetting actually works, then the implication would be that that all the things that we've talked about are actually even harder and even more urgent. So it's 40% reduction in traffic or something if you're not including offsetting. So it would be probably quite good for the Assembly to form a view on how long is offsetting going to remain in the frame as a legitimate approach to meeting targets, because at some point, as we all converge globally on net zero, the availability of offsets, even if they did work, which there's no evidence that they do, will just dry up altogether. So we kind of need to have some clarity on when are we going to actually just get off offsets and stop allowing them to be a way to meet regulatory requirements. Ben's example is just one example. Thank you.
Thank you, and clarity seems like a good place to end that. So I'm going to say thank you very much to all our guests. I think I speak for all of those when I say that was an excellent discussion, really informative, full of different views and community views, so thank you very much. The rest of the committee have a few items of business to deal with before we end the session, so feel free to stay. It'll only be a couple of minutes, or feel free to leave the chamber, depending on where you have to be. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for the Environment Committee for the 2022-23 Assembly year? Thank you. The next meeting of the Environment Committee is scheduled for 7th of February 2023 at 10 o'clock in the Chamber of City Hall. I see there's no more urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you.